editor of the collection Reality Unbound, New Departures in Science Fiction Cinema, which was published in 2017, and co-founder of Alphaville, Journal of Film and Screen Media. Dr. Power's presentation is entitled In Our Immense Sarcophagus We Lay, Charting the Anthropocene in EU Science Fiction Films. Our second speaker today will be Dr. Paul Bucholtz, who is an associate professor of German at Emory University. He is author of Private Anarchy, Impossible Community, and The Outsider's Monologue in German Experimental Fiction, which was published by Northwestern University Press in 2018. Dr. Bucholtz's talk is called Nomadism in the Environmental Dystopias of Sophie Klotz and Nicholas Born. And our third speaker today will be Dr. Evan Torner, who is an assistant professor of German studies at the University of Cincinnati, where he also serves as undergraduate director of German studies and the director of the UC Game Lab. He is co-founder and an editor of the journal Analog Game Studies, and his primary fields of expertise include East German genre cinema, critical race theory, science fiction, and role-playing games. Dr. Torner will give a talk entitled Whiteness, Pessimism, and Futurity in German Science Fiction Cinema. And without further ado, Dr. Power, I will give you the floor.
Okay, thank you very much, Natasha, and thank you so much to Priscilla for inviting me. I was delighted to be involved, and to Priscilla, indeed Alison, and everyone else who's been involved in organizing this symposium. I'll just sort of echo to begin with something Gabriel Trop said yesterday. I realize there's more interesting things happening in the world right now than me speaking. So if you want to, move over to see what's happening in Pennsylvania at any time, I certainly won't be offended. Okay, I'm going to share my screen. Hopefully this will work. Okay. How is that? Is that okay? Okay, I'm going to do something bold to begin with. I'm going to try and play a trailer just to see if it works. I'm going to play a minute of this. The reason I just want to give you a sort of brief idea of Anyara, the film I'm going to talk about today. I realize, it's very possible that you may not have seen it. So give me a shout if the sound doesn't work, but, fingers crossed it will.
Välkommen ombord på Anyara. Vi är ett toppmodernt transportsätt som kommer att ta dig hela vägen ifrån jorden till Mars på 3 veckor.
Tyvärr innebär detta att vi inte längre kan styra Anyara. När vi passerar en tillräckligt stor himlakropp så kommer vi med hjälp av gravitationen från den kunna vända tillbaka i kurs. Exakt hur lång tid det kan bli frågan om kan jag i nuläget inte besvara.
Okay, so My paper today will survey European responses to the climate crisis and migration through the 2018 Swedish-Danish film Anyara, directed by Peter Kagaman and Hugo Lila. Anyara is an adaptation of the eponymous 1956 epic poem on atomic age anxiety by Swedish Nobel laureate Harry Martinson. Anyara, I will argue, foregrounds existential struggle of a kind routinely faced elsewhere by people across the globe by forcing its protagonists to adapt to a world where being European does not automatically confer advantage and where the Anthropocene eradicates privileges gained from centuries of colonialist expansion. To be more explicit still, my thesis is that in updating Martinson's response to the nuclear age to cater for a human-created geological epoch, Anyara forces us to re-examine historical narratives spun by the European Union, attendant progress narratives central to modernity, and ultimately, possibly, the future of the EU itself. In her recent article, Nomenclature, Narrative, and Novum, the Anthropocene and as Science Fiction, Rebecca Evans argues that efforts to rename the era of climate change and privilege the descriptor Anthropocene purposely, and I quote, call up novel narratives predicated specifically on the embedding of an estranged novum into a story world that diverges significantly from the known world, end quote. Anthropocene, Evans argues, becomes nomenclature, narrative, and, drawing upon Darko-Suvin's conceptualization of cognitive estrangement, novum. To identify the science fictionality of the Anthropocene, she writes, is, and I quote, to recognize that the term introduces a novum that differentiates itself from our prior sense of the world, integrates that novum into a future-oriented but historically grounded narrative, and uses that narrative to direct a re-examination of modernity, end quote. The Anthropocene science fictionality, Evans continues, helps us to think, and I quote, not only about possible futures, but also about the particular histories that contribute to those futures, and produces estrangement by positing the hegemonic and imperialist history of Western modernity as itself a fabulation, and a dangerous and inaccurate one at that. So what I want to suggest here is that such a reading has relevance to the EU, and that Anyara, with its haunting depiction of the last humans fleeing a destroyed Earth, can help emphasize the connection. So while the EU has been lauded in recent years for its efforts to combat climate change, we can think of the Kyoto Protocol, for instance, the Paris Agreement too, and in the current global context can appear as a bulwark against nativism and authoritarianism, its current market-driven trajectory and the policies that undergird it are, at least to my mind, plainly unsustainable. The Anthropocene, in short, demands that the collective, and it's important here that we remember the EU as a collective, if an uneasy one, subject itself to an urgent and honest re-evaluation. As the birthplace of the Enlightenment, Europe has been both progenitor and chief beneficiary of modernity. As the world's preeminent colonizer, moreover, in the birthplace of the Industrial Revolution, it has also been a major contributor to both climate change and the radical inequality it accelerates. European integration, it's worth noting, was a utopian project of sorts, or at a minimum, a direct response to the dystopian horrors of the Second World War and the advent of the atomic age. The nightmare of totalitarianism expedited this process, with the Allies' victory serving, in Jürgen Habermas's words, to undermine the foundations of all forms of political legitimation that did not, at least verbally, at least in word, subscribe to the universalist spirit of political enlightenment. To create Europe is to create peace, Jean Monnet famously declared, and given the relative peace that has persisted in Europe in the intervening decades, this historical reading appears convincing. And yet, Monet's formulation remains at least somewhat problematic, for it rests upon a partial reading of history that overlooks the colonial undercurrents of the European project, undercurrents that in turn continue to have major anthropocentric ramifications. European integration coincided with the slow death of colonialism in its traditional forms. You can see, I think this slide is quite self-explanatory. So, sorry, as European integration coincided with the slow death of colonialism in its traditional forms, it would be easy to equate the two. Indeed, EU leaders have actively encouraged such thinking. As evidence of this trend, the Swedish political scientists P.O. Hansen and Stefan Jönsson point to the 2007 EU-Africa Summit and resultant Lisbon Declaration, which glowingly referred to the Treaty of Rome, describing 2007 as the year that we celebrate the 50th anniversary of European integration and the 50th anniversary of the beginning of independence of Africa. The difficulty, as Hansen and Johnson explain, is that the Lisbon Declaration simultaneously, and I quote, created the impression that these processes were quite compatible, even mutually interdependent in harmonious ways, whereas in reality, the EEC's founding members made a point of stressing the collective's massive extra-European scope, which was then designated as Euro-Africa and institutionalized and codified in the Rome Treaties Colonial Association, end quote. Today, European exploitation of Africa continues apace via resource extraction and bilateral trade agreements that disproportionately EU and contribute to the continual destruction of the planet. There have been attempts to mitigate this in recent years, but it still remains a hugely uneven trade agreement. To give but one contemporary example, up until a few months ago, and again, this is still being sorted out, many African nations were still compelled to maintain at least 50% of their foreign exchange reserves in an operations account controlled by the French Treasury. A practice that has origins in the slave trade and can be traced back to the Haitian Revolution. Such practices then are well established, as Walter Rodney memorably reminded us on how Europe underdeveloped Africa. Little wonder then that Frantz Fanon, writing in 1961, had limited hopes for a new Europe. Noting in the Wretched of the Earth that the European game has finally ended, Fanon enjoined his readers to, and I quote, look at them today swaying between atomic and spiritual disintegration and find alternative models to draw inspiration from. Not that one encounters such thinking within European institutions, which, with some exceptions, continue to perpetuate an airbrushed version of European history. And here we are. Alina Sierp takes this theme up in a recent analysis of documents from European Parliament, Justice and Home Affairs Council, and European Council meetings. Despite being highly active in using memory as a mechanism for public sphere formation, Sierp observes that the EU has been slow to engage with its own colonial history. To date, she argues that, and I quote, all European efforts for transnational historical remembrance are focused almost exclusively on the Holocaust and National Socialism as well as Stalinism, whereas the EU remains curiously quiet about memories of colonialism and imperialism, with human catastrophes, civil wars and border conflicts, state collapses, terror attacks, and environmental and climate catastrophes appearing to the European public to have little to do with this history. Selective silence towards civil rights atrocities committed by European colonial powers appears to be at least a partial EU strategy, with the collective eager to downplay such remembrance lest it hinder economic ties or bring up the prospect of reparations. And yet, if it's unable to come to terms with the past, it's difficult to see how the EU can alter unsustainable present actions that will come to define its future. Kagerman and Leah's adaptation of Anyara, as we shall now see, makes this lesson clear. Scored to ominous music, Anyara begins with a montage of flooding, tornadoes, dust clouds, and wildfires playing over the opening credits. We follow a woman, played by Emily Garbers, known by her job title of Mimarobe, or MR as I'll now refer to her, being transported to the spaceship Anyara, which will take her and her fellow passengers to Mars. Prominent in the background as MR boards the Anyara is an advertisement for a bank, slogan "We Love Mars," while a close-up of a deck plan reveals that the ship houses a food court, shopping malls, bowling alleys, a champagne bar, and spa. We also glimpse the ship's mascot, a suitably nondescript giant corporate bird. Here he is in the top right-hand corner, a suitably nondescript giant corporate bird with a maniacal grin frozen across its lifeless face. These early establishing shots foreground a sense of luxury that jars with the images of devastating ecological crisis that precedes them. As Mima Robe, MR is charged with overseeing the ship's Mima, a HAL-like supercomputer that soothes passengers by mining their subconscious for bucolic images of the Earth before it succumbed to anthropocentric devastation. As MR explains to indifferent passengers, simply put, she transports us to Earth as it once was. The passengers, who happily pass the time consuming, pay her little heed. Indeed, in the Jamesonian twist, the end of the world has happened, but its evacuated population seem hell-bent on replicating the capitalist models that precipitated the apocalypse. The absurdity of this is implied throughout, yet the impact of Anyara's critique is enhanced by the director's aesthetic choices. Despite the SF premise, the film works hard to maintain an odd sense of realism. Sophie Vinquist, the film's director of photography, privileges tight framing throughout, creating a documentary feel accentuated by shaky handheld cameras, while the set designers make extensive use of real-life cruise ships, centers, and shopping malls to satisfy Kageman and Leah's desire for what they call a no-set sci-fi. Shot through with neologisms and heavy and arcane description, Martinson's work doesn't readily lend itself to straight-up adaptation. By instead rendering it mundane, I would argue the directors familiarize the unfamiliar and remind us that we too inhabit the Anthropocene and are highly vulnerable. Underscoring this, in a minor but notable departure from Martinson's poem, the Anyara is knocked permanently off course by space debris as opposed to a meteor, a reminder of anthropocentric activity that shifts the root cause of the crisis from cosmic intervention to human recklessness. COVID-19 is but the latest example of the EU's vulnerability to external crisis. The fiscal contagion that spread across the Eurozone in 2009 and threatened the EU's existence remains fresh in the mind of those subjected to resultant austerity policies, and the economic fault lines that emerged then have resurfaced in the past few months. Similarly, despite concerted efforts, the EU has been singularly unable to arrive at any sort of consensus on how best to deal with the migration crisis on its borders. In this vein, Harry Martinson's many descriptions of refugees fleeing the earth in terror take on new relevance for contemporary audiences. Within this new communicative situation, it's very hard to ignore this. Considering the many tragedies that have befallen migrants attempting to reach Europe by crossing the Mediterranean, the potent symbolism of a ship full of migrants languishing hopelessly between landmasses should be obvious. Taking in the Mima's destruction and the film's bittersweet conclusion, I will close out this paper by illustrating how Anyara crystallizes these intersections between capitalism, migration, and the Anthropocene, and in so doing, gesture toward the pitfalls of selective remembrance and the continuation of business as usual for the EU. At an emergency public meeting, the ship's captain, Schiavone, who's really a facsimile of every bland technocratic leader ever created, calmly announces that passengers should remain calm, even though we've been knocked off course and cannot turn back. Much to their consternation, he adds that the planned 3-week journey will now take no longer than 2 years. In measured tones, Schiavone gaslights the audience by stressing that things are going well generally and that compliance will be key. Sentiments that'll sound familiar to anyone paying attention during the Eurozone crisis. Schiavone's announcement triggers a huge upsurge in Mima usage, with passengers desperate to get some respite. So again, as I said, the Mima is like a VR, a sort of HAL-like machine that delves into this collective conscious to present sort of bucolic images of the Earth before it was destroyed. This overuse among passengers soon imperils the system, and the MR is the first to take note. Emphasizing the strain being placed on it, she pleads with Schiavone to switch the machine off, a request he flatly refuses. The preview we saw earlier shows what happens next, but to recap, MR's initially pleasant experience, a virtual experience of swimming in a rural lake, is shattered when the birds she spots flying overhead disintegrate in midair. So again, I should emphasize again that she's using the Mima to try and get away from things for a while. The scene in question, as you can see here, references John Everett Millay's 1852 portrait of Ophelia, moments before her death. With Ophelia, Millay controversially afforded minute attention to detail and afforded minute attention to nature and granted the landscape equal importance to his human subject, depicting flowers and vegetation with incredible attention to detail. Partially submerged beside a riverbank that is at once verdant and decaying, Ophelia has purple flowers around her neck and is in the process of being reclaimed by nature. Randall Martin's analysis of the painting in Shakespeare and ecology is suggestive. Reading Ophelia's body as worm food, Martin argues that reimagining Millay's continually adapted image of Ophelia as riparian detritus represents the kind of dark ecological turn necessary for environmentalism to move beyond romantic aesthetics of nature. The images of nature projected by the Mima are similarly detailed. Auburn leaves crunch underfoot as the Amor makes her way to the water, while purple flowers again are visible. They float in the foreground as she enters it and floats on her back. On a technical level, color filters are applied to accentuate the greens of the vegetation. The effect, I would argue, is both a heightened yet unsustainable and aesthetic, and a premonition of death, with the disintegrating birds redolent of chickens coming home to roost. This will be amongst the last of the peaceful images that the Mima will project, its heightened awareness of the Anthropocene, reducing it instead to presenting images of fire, waste, and apocalypse. You can just get a glimpse of this on screen. Crucially, the Mima's self-destruction comes about after it is no longer able to sustain a narrative of progress. The present impedes upon the past in the form of human-created space debris. Before exploding, the Mima quotes directly from Martinson to make the link explicit. And I quote from his poem, "There is protection from near everything, from fire and damages by storm and frost. Oh, add whichever blows may come to mind, but there is no protection from mankind." So, cults form on the Anyara and suicides rates soar, as in Martinson's poem. Look at them swaying between atomic and the spiritual disintegration, Fanon reminds us. And despite brief moments of relief, the film ends in bittersweet fashion. Kagaman and Leah cut from a brief description of year 24, the sarcophagus, wherein an aged Amor and a handful of fellow survivors sit listlessly amongst the ruins of the Anyara, to year let's just say 6 million years in the future, Lyra constellation, where the Anyara passes a luminescent star, presumably the Vega, which was charted by Ptolemy in the 2nd century. On closer inspection, the star reveals itself in bright greens and blues, revealing a planet much like Earth. There are no humans present, yet the music that closes the scene out is surprisingly upbeat, in marked contrast to the opening scene of the film, and also in keeping with both directors' intention to try and have a slightly more upbeat than that in Martinson's poem. The image of the verdant new planet remains over the credits, suggesting another world is literally possible and that the models we cling to are by no means exhaustive. Crucially, and I'm almost at a close here, it's only when the Mima relays the true causes of the Anthropocene, causes that jar with selective membranes, that the system breaks down and fragments. Similarly, despite the EU's self-congratulatory narratives, and I would stress here I am a supporter of the EU, but a critical supporter, a reckoning is due, one that necessitates unpacking of Enlightenment values and Eurocentric assumptions that underpin its very mission. Today, that mission reveals itself through a pursuance of simultaneous expansion and exclusion that doubles down on Fortress Europe and extends colonial era imbalances hidden in plain sight within the Treaty of Rome. This in turn accelerates material consequences that are plainly unsustainable. The specter of the Anthropocene, which, as Evans reminds us, posits the hegemonic and imperialist history of Western modernity as itself a fabulation, necessitates an urgent rethink. Reverting to the mean will no longer suffice. A reckoning, Anyara reminds us, is long overdue. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Dr. Power. That was very, very great to listen to and to hear your insights. Now we'll hear from Paul Bucholtz, Dr. Paul Bucholtz.
Thanks so much, Natasha, and thank you to Priscilla Lane and to everyone who worked to make this happen. despite all of the challenges and delays from the original planned event. That would have been so nice to see you all. I was supposed to fly from Vienna to be there, but at any rate, I'm very happy to be here in Georgia today. So good afternoon from Atlanta. And I've changed the title of my talk. I've wavered a little bit on exactly what to call this, because also my research has yielded some other sort of discoveries since I first conceived this talk. So I'm going to share my screen now and start the slide. As you can see, I've just sort of chosen a slightly more generic title and added another text. So I've called this now Displacement and Migration in the Environmental Dystopias of Nicholas Bourne, Sophie Klotz, and Michael Springer. And I'm going to start my presentation with the question that Priscilla Lane sent to me that was kind of the motivating impulse for the panel, which is how do European countries' fears of limited resources, overcrowding, and pollution relate to their concerns about migration? And how is this reflected in literature and film? And I think that from a contemporary vantage point, I want to recommend two forthcoming articles by Joella Jacobs and Tanja Nusser that are going to be in a forthcoming issue of Colloquia Germanica, co-edited by Carlina Schaumann and myself. It's called Ecological Archives. And Nusser's article looks at how environmental discourses played a role in xenophobic talk of Flüchtlingsströme, the streams or the floods of migrants coming from Europe in 2015. And it also, Jacobs looks on the sort of the other side of the political spectrum at how the paternalistic Willkommenskultur that is pro-asylum seeker and pro-migrant integrates environmentalism as a kind of a pedagogical a way of controlling these people and integrating them and imposing a certain view of what the good life is. I think that, so I'm going to take a way of answering this question that goes more the route of literary and political history and goes back to the origins of green and environmental movements in Germany, in West Germany and Austria, focusing on the 1970s and 1980s. Which was a time that saw the explosion of environmentalism in both of these countries, first as a technocratic expert discourse, and then as a grassroots and protest movement. This grassroots movement was politically eclectic, creating unusual alliances, such as between Christian conservatives and Maoist students, but its major protests were associated with the Linksalternatives milieu, the young participants of the alternative movements of the New Left, and these built on critiques of state power that originated with the 1960s student movement. So if the time around 1980 was really a watershed moment for green movements, where these grassroots movements really started to become a political force that consolidated into coalitions and parties, this time around 1980 was also a watershed moment for political xenophobia in general and the New Right in particular, signaled, for instance, by the publication of the racist Heidelberger Manifest in 1981, signed by 14 university professors, which warned of quote-unquote over-foreignization, Überfremdung, through the influx of, quote, large masses of non-German foreigners, unquote, große Masse nicht-deutsche Ausländer. And this manifesto used more or less unfiltered National Socialist language. The mainstreaming and normalization of right-wing extremism through populist discourse of Überfremdung gained steam beginning in 1989 and throughout the 1990s, following the end of the Cold War and German reunification. But of course, the CDU-CSU coalition with the FDP stated in their Treaty of 1982 that Germany is not a country of integration. So this was really a time when mainstream political discourse in Germany was beginning to integrate an anti-immigrant sentiment. Now, where the political coalition of the Greens in Germany stood on these issues is complicated. Historian Rita Chin notes, for instance, that, quote, that the Green Party had a far less clearly articulated position on the guest worker question in the early 80s, unquote. And the Greens did support a liberal asylum policy, and by the 1990s adopted the position that, according to historians Andrei Markovits and Philip Gorski, that the Federal Republic is to remain open to anyone who wants to come and settle here. So indeed, the Greens apparently did come to resist the political xenophobia of the 1980s, But this is really a narrow answer to the question, because the broader question of this panel, as I see it, is how environmentalist discourse intersected with anti-immigrant discourse in the culture at large, and not just in party politics. So zooming out a little bit, in public consciousness around this time of the 1970s and 1980s, the prospect of a planetary environmental collapse tended to be defined in terms of a chain of interlinked crises, defined by, for instance, the fear of nuclear war on the one hand, and limits to growth on the other hand. That is the exhaustion of the planet through pollution and overconsumption in wealthy countries, where nuclear energy was stepping in to fill demand for increased energy use. And another interlinked crisis from this kind of list of this chain of different crises of the environment was so-called overpopulation, a concept that the American biologist Paul Ehrlich described with his slogan, the population bomb. The Austrian communist writer Leopold Spira, who penned an article about the United Nations 1974 Conference on Population Growth in Bucharest, article called Pille oder Entwicklung, Pill or Development, pointed out the racialized and neo-imperialist agenda of overpopulation discourse as it was presented in Germany and Austria. So here's the quote. I'm going to read this in English. Because the Federal Republic, and actually also the German Democratic Republic, has arrived at zero growth of population, the meaning of these Weltuntergangsprognose, this prognosis of the end of the world, is clear. In order to save humanity, the whites, whose birth rates are low, have to force people of color, die Farbigen, to limit their unhemmed reproduction, ihre ungehemmte Vermehrung, their uncontained reproduction, right? So that's unquote. So what Spira makes clear in this 1974 essay, and which would be consistent in discourse of environmentalism for the next decade, is that concepts of whiteness and racism are primarily present in environmental discourse, in imagining a more, with imagining a global framework. They're present on the international stage in relation to the so-called third world, and not as something observable domestically in the everyday. In discussions of world population, the phenomenon of migration, the recruitment of workers from the global south, the movement of people across national boundaries, and changing demographics are barely thematized. There are people of color in environmental discourse, and oftentimes too many, according to overpopulation doomsayers, but they tend to live in far-off lands, and their threat to natural resources is not located in Europe. Spira sees these fears as a form of racialized eugenics, and that they work through international organizations such as the UN. So in short, these the discursive pieces are in place here at this time for the 21st century fears in Europe of a Menschenflut or Flüchtlingsstrom of refugees. But the topic of actual migration is absent. That is, you just don't see very much thematization of migration directly in a lot of this discourse. Another point I want to make is that one has to draw a distinction between technocratic and elitist forms of environmentalism that originally introduced these issues into the public eye around 1970, such as the Club of Rome, and the eugenicist green politics of conservative founding member of the Greens in Germany, Herbert Gröll. So there's these more elitist forms of environmentalism. And on the other hand, there's the environmentalism of the left alternative milieu that became associated with environmental protest increasingly over the course of the 1970s. This milieu was more inclined to embrace a Marxist understanding of the causes of environmental destruction, and to see them as a part of colonialism and primitive accumulation of natural resources. So the claim would be that the fear of overpopulation was much more prevalent in, the fear of overpopulated third world was much more prevalent in the elitist and technocratic forms of environmentalism, and had much less of a role to play in these more left-leaning subcultural and explicitly Marxist forms of environmentalism, because there they saw environmental problems globally as a part of a world system of capitalism. But on the other hand, as Günter Grass tried to show in his admittedly very flawed metafictional work from 1980, Head Births, or The Germans Are Dying Out, Kopfgeburten oder Die Deutschen sterben aus, in public consciousness, even on the pro-immigrant left, fears of nuclear power and of an overpopulated third world often mingled in discussions of reproductive politics. So oftentimes these ideas of overcrowded slums in the third world were very much also a part of the left alternative milieu. So I've really spent a lot of time on context, and I did that partly because I feel I can, when I'm presenting on Zoom and listening on Zoom, I process sort of information in some ways better than I do analysis. But what I'm trying to just show is the way that the issue of race and of white supremacy is a factor in environmental discourse of this time, but it is not typically overtly through a thematization of migration. That happens from the far right when they are involved in environmentalist discourse. So that the only people who are self-avowed environmentalists talking about migration are the neo-Nazis and the new right that's ascendant at this time. And they do get involved in environmental protest as well. The kind of non-explicitly right-wing or xenophobic or Nazi kind of forms of environmentalism tend to be more afraid about the third world, right? And they may be afraid of overpopulation, or they may see it as a victim of the West, but they don't necessarily imagine people moving between Europe and the so-called third world. So what I want to do in the time remaining is to examine three different, basically science fiction texts that are from this time period, all of which are written by white authors born in West Germany and Austria, which take up the issue of an environmental dystopia, of a threatened planetary future, and they also thematize displacement and migration, but not by, in any case, actually narrating the perspective of non-white or non-European immigrants. So I'm going to basically be looking at a set of blind spots that I think are all different and all interesting. And I think that this can help to contribute to thinking about, how is it that the earlier green movements really didn't think about migration very much, and what did they think about instead, right? So the first thing I'm going to talk about is the 1975 dystopian short story Radikale Ernte, or Radical Harvest, by Nicholas Bourne, which was published in 1978 in a collection of utopian stories. So this story focuses on a nuclear family. There's an unnamed father, his wife Maria, and their genderless child, it's not stated, who are attempting to flee the encroaching dystopia of a sprawling metropolis, which is governed as a police state. So there's this image of this kind of city in the horizon that's endlessly expanding, and there's these henchmen with helicopters and chainsaws who are coming out to destroy all the nature around the city, so that the city keeps growing more and more and taking over all of the countryside. And so, you can read this is the narration on the first page. Shortly after nightfall, we left our farm. The new rulers would not wait long to bring about our premature end. We were in possession of some ideas, including one set down in writing, which directly involved life after the radical harvest. In any case, such as we were, we represented a danger. I don't know which danger, but they must have known. So this family is driven from their farm, and they face displacement, starvation, radioactive poisoning, and finally marital collapse, all narrated by the father, an ironic and unreliable narrator who tries in vain to hide his own guilt and complicity in the failures faced by his family. Under the pressures of starvation and persecution, the family dissolves and joins up with a countercultural artists colony before being finally apprehended by the authorities of the police state. Without locating itself in any explicit setting, other than a mention and passing of the Elbe River in Germany, the text traces the fate of two different leftist groups, that is, the alternative nuclear family and a countercultural commune that they join up with later on, all of which are attempting to resist or flee industrial society's destruction of the natural environment. So Bourne's story imagines a small band of dreamers and resistors who seek an alternative to authoritarianism and consumerism and are driven further and further into a post-apocalyptic wasteland. Bourne's story presents these countercultural characters as de facto refugees from a destructive system that refuses to leave any natural outside intact. And they indeed are eventually captured by the authorities and reintegrated into the system of the city. It is only the child, the ungendered child of the narrator and Maria, that successfully escapes and flees these henchmen. This child is described as being sort of like a mutant, like it's no longer fully human. And unlike its parents, it successfully escapes into the wastelands far behind the city. So you can see it's being described here as having these roguish reserves that it grows into something unfamiliar. It grows into the greatest rogue in world history. And finally, in the last lines of the story, it escapes by clutching onto a piece of wood that's drifting down a river and then off into the horizon. So the story invests all of its hope finally in a being that is no longer really a human being, that flees civilization and humanity itself, a radically homeless figure that is also unknowable to the narrator and to the reader. I'm having trouble looking at the clock on my computer. How much time do I have?
Just about five minutes.
Okay, great. So I'm going to go quickly through the other examples and maybe speak somewhat extemporaneously. The next story that I want to look at is actually it is a treatment. It is a partial film script. It's an abstract and a piece of a film script written by the Innsbruck poet Sophie Klotz and published in a regional literary journal in 1987 called Zeitschrift für Literatur. And here there's an analogous set of themes. And of course, this is something that very few people read, and it was never made into a film, but I find it really remarkable to see how these discourses are evident in so many different works. Klotz approaches environmental destruction through a scenario of forced exile from the cities as well. Just as with Bourne's story, Klotz's film sees the city as the core of all social ills and environmental threats, including overcrowding and an overpopulation. The text seems to take place in the United States, given that the characters have names like Johnny. And the scenario, the dystopian scenario here involves the outbreak of a pandemic in the cities, which is more or less explicitly modeled on HIV/AIDS. And the idea here is that these cities have become, they've destroyed themselves in a way that have led to ecological disturbances. And the human beings who escape these cities that have been destroyed have suffered degenerate after effects from that unnatural life of living in the cities, and that people are no longer immune to basic viruses and bacteria. And the implication is that then this thing that sounds like AIDS, HIV/AIDS, in fact, this is even mentioned, is not the result of a particular virus, but it's actually a result of an unnatural way of life, which I think that fits fairly well with some of the more extreme right-wing interpretations of HIV/AIDS in the 1980s. So the causality of this narrative is not fully clear, since it proceeds like a dream sequence, but the main event in the story is the formation of a resistance movement, where 6 young characters who have somehow maintained their biological vitality escape their internment in these kind of concentration camps that are created outside of the city for the refugees. These vital, young, kind of utopian, kind of messiah type characters end up creating an alternative colony then on an empty field outside of the city by hijacking cars of other refugee families fleeing the city, and then kind of like, not through violence, but through a form of charisma and coaxing, convincing these people to come with them in their cars to this one gathering place in a field, where the cars then are turned into the building blocks of a new kind of like nomadic settlement. And here, this is like Klotz's vision of like a kind of an alternative to the consumeristic and destructive forms of urban life. As you can see, there's this line here: life now plays out in the cars. They've become a living space. One sees a mother with 3 children who has set herself up as comfortably as is possible in a car. The smallest, the baby, is calmed down. The 2 older women bring from the central coal stove, which is surrounded by women and children, a bowl with soup or a stew with bread. The oldest child serves the soup into bowls and breaks the bread. And so you can see there's the nuclear family has sort of vanished, and what you have here is like this image of a feminist collective of mothers working together in an open air kitchen to serve the children. There are male characters here, but the figure of the mother is sort of the central building block of this new society. So what I find in okay, excuse me, since I've been paraphrasing, I have skipped over some here. So these refugees, now utopian nomads living in cars, are not ethnically or racially marked in any way, so presumably white, and they are the ones who are fleeing from and seeking an alternative to Western modernity. So in other words, Klotz's film script, like Bourne's story, asks its viewers to imagine counterculture as a kind of an intentional community of refugees. So what I'm finding in these science fictional texts is that forced displacement of refugees and as well as voluntary migration of nomads become conflated and somewhat idealized in imagined stories where it is above all nature lovers, those who want to hold on to a natural way of living, who are the ones who are most persecuted and displaced by the mechanisms of dominant society. So it is not really a particular group, oppressed group that is racially or ethnically marked. It's really like anyone who remains natural is the one who's being oppressed. Now there is an exception to this trend, but I see that I'm running out of time. So I just want to refer briefly to this novel, Brunnen by Michael Springer, which is a very good a satirical science fiction novel that is from exactly the same time period, 1981. It initially appeared. It's not perfect, but what I find interesting here is that it creates a much more detailed account of a geopolitics. So it's taking place in a kind of alternate version of Europe that has a colonial past. And so there is a country called Freiland, which stands in for Germany, and a neighboring country that stands in for France. Freiland has a history of racial persecution, and the main character is a descendant of people who were suffered under that racial persecution, which is not called the Holocaust, and they're not called Jews, but it's referred to in vague terms. And the neighboring country has a history of colonialism, and they do use the word North Africa to describe the colony. It's basically Algeria, because it's described as having had a bloody war of independence to separate itself from this neighboring country. But what happens in this story is that you have this character who develops a commitment to environmentalism in this town of Brunnen in the country of Freiland, but he travels to these other places and witnesses actually guest workers returning from Europe to the countries they're working in Europe to North Africa. And what he sees in this country, which is basically Algeria, is he has this thought about how, he's watching how the streets are full of, dirt and garbage, right? So this is a really, there's a really very stereotypical depictions of the global South here. But he's thinking about how the issue of environmental destruction is still distant here. And it's an interesting line, noch war das Problem der Umweltzerstörung fern, because it shows that his own European environmentalism that he is committed to as a political cause is highly situated in his own particular position in this country that is basically Germany. And he becomes aware of privileges that he has in thinking about environmentalism in a certain way, even as the child of these basically refugees from a history of racial persecution. So I think that the fact that these themes were present in this one work shows, how limiting oftentimes these narratives of environmental dystopia were at the time. And I think that these blind spots are not, and there's blind spots in Springer's novel as well. I think that these are not meaningless blind spots. They show oftentimes how really vague notions of oppression and solidarity were built into environmental movements of the 70s and 80s. And I think that it's something that even now is still being worked through by those who identify as green in the present. So I'm going to end there, and I hope you were able to bear with me with my extemporaneous summaries. And I want to thank you all again for giving me the opportunity to present this research.
Thank you, Dr. Bucholtz. And now I get to turn it over to Dr. Torner.
Oh, did I stop sharing? I'll stop sharing. Yeah.
Oh, thank you, Natasha, and thanks also to Priscilla and all of the organizers here who have done a fantastic job and make this sort of seamless experience in the awkward environment of Zoom. One thing about my bio is that between March when I was supposed to present and November when I am presenting, I got tenure. So now I'm an associate professor of German studies at University of Cincinnati. I think there's a salary bump. That's about it. I feel grateful and honored to have that position in such kind of apocalyptic times. But let's talk more about that apocalypse. This is that particular conference after all. Can you all see that? Good. Okay. So what I'm talking about today is sort of the breadth of German sci-fi cinema, and because I'm turning in my manuscript on like 110 years of German sci-fi cinema this year, I will in some ways indulge a tour of that weird corpus just cause, and bear with me in that respect. In 2020, our futures depend on addressing anti-Black racism, not only in societies in the USA, but also Europe and specifically Germany. Yet, white German anxiety stands at the center of German science fiction film, the foremost future genre. With some optimistic exceptions, right? The Weimar era documentary, Our Heavenly Bodies from 1925, or even uncomfortably, the Nazi film, World Spaceship One launches. These are sort of the optimistic films that champion technology unironically and unabashedly. Most German sci-fi cinema is in fact pessimistic and envisions the future as a bad thing. German science fictions envision this bleak outcome in which social, technological, and natural forces all conspire to produce either dystopian suffering or bare life survival, with maybe a glimpse of hope for the protagonist at the end. We'll see. So sometimes you have, as in the case of Algol from 1920, the source of the collective misery is individual. A single tragic Faustian bargain. An alien being from the star of Algol gives Robert Herrner, played by Emil Jannings, a prototype perpetual motion machine which can generate unlimited electricity. He discovers then 20 years later, because he owns all the power, he gets all the power, and power corrupts him and everything goes bad. So what does he do? Rather than bureaucratize or regulate the machine, he just destroys the machine. So you have a white inventor who's invented nothing, gets everything more or less handed to him, and then he destroys it so that other people can't benefit from it. Other times you have, as in the case of the East German sci-fi classic 50 years later, you have a politically dominant class that's subjugating another one. In The Dust of the Stars features a sort of Star Trek-esque East German, or I would say international communist space crew that lands on TEM 4 and discovers that those inhabitants are subjugating the Turi, who are people who literally live under the ground working in the mines for them. And the only solution offered at the end is a long, unrewarding struggle for revolution. Then we have, so we have individuals and class struggle, and then we have another source of pessimism, which is, say, on Netflix. The enemy is time itself. I know that's weird, but I don't think season 3 did the first 2 seasons justice. So time itself is made out to be the enemy. The intensely claustrophobic time travel plot resolves once everyone works out their proper relationship to time and acceptance of death, so that most characters just die or cease to exist overall, and that's the solution. In Padorum, the source of our misery is ignorance, in which this is a horror thriller where some people wake up in cryosleep on a ship, and they discover it's overrun with aliens, but actually the aliens are people who have just evolved from hundreds of years from an earlier kind of biologically, genetically modified species on the ship, and they wind up taking over. And of course, they're not floating out in space. The twist is that they happen to be on a planet. So if they had just walked out an airlock, they would have been fine. So ignorance is literally the enemy here. So whether an individual, social class, technology, or abstract entity is to blame for humanity's ills. However, what's worth mentioning in these films is that a white protagonist will always serve as the primary focalizer of the narrative, the figure onto whom we project our hopes and fears, who we also get to make the decision that seals fates. And so there's always these moments of epic decision that are posed, this decision that's going to impact a greater future. Whiteness, as defined by Peggy Pisha and Nicola Lorey El Samurai in 2018, has several components of note here. It is, as they say, a comprehensive social positionality within capitalist racialized patriarchal societies, and is part of a structural equipment to dominate, categorize, and order the world. Furthermore, whiteness is, quote, used to mark the so-called other without marking the so-called self. Bearers of whiteness benefit from discriminatory categories of differences which have been implemented as an increasingly globalized matrix of domination and normalization, end quote. And then critical whiteness studies is actually the Black collective knowledge of survival, which is, as they quote from Bell Hooks, gleaned from close scrutiny of white people, and not a way of knowing that has been recorded fully in written material. So again, we have an idea that not only whiteness structures the social order, but it's also supposed to remain invisible. And it is not fully recorded because there are still people every day who use their knowledge of white people to survive being, violently confronted or marginalized by those same white people. Finally, given the environmentalism subject of this particular talk, or sorry, of this particular conference, it is a capitalist order dominated by white people that ultimately controls the fate and resources and waste for billions of people. The world's chief polluter, by the way, is the American military. Followed also by major Western companies with considerable stock portfolios and records of environmental disaster. So white agency and control really stand at the center of our current unfolding environmental catastrophe, which is why I'm interested again in these narratives of white anxiety or helplessness against the future. And we'll get to the moment in film history where I find that quite interesting, which is specifically after the financial crisis of 2008, 2009. And so the three films I'll be looking at is Transfer from 2010, Hell from 2011, and The Coming Days from 2010, all made within the same 18-month period, and are preoccupied again with a apocalyptic society that white people can't quite grapple with. So German science fiction in the past 120 years, of course, has its own long history of dealing with race and racialization. So you have a movement from racist colonial portrayals of non-white people over to those that we would classify as a racial state, and I'll get to what that means in a second. We have the discovery of Germany, die Entdeckung Deutschlands from 1916, which is a piece of World War I propaganda, in which the Germans could not imagine a white European civilization that would tell an objective story about how things were actually totally fine during a starvation, a famine in Germany during World War I. And so they invented the Martians, who would then come to give an objective opinion. And of course, this is one of these moments where because no white European news agency could comment, they would never have dreamed of asking someone outside of Europe or the Americas to be the objective people. So the Martians are displaced other that will comment and say how great things are. Then we have Metropolis, where you can see at the bottom of Brigitte Helm's Robot Maria is playing the Whore of Babylon here. and during the Yoshiwara sequence, and of course at her feet are Louis Brody, as well as other Afro-German and African actors, which is what Tobias Nagel describes as a footnote of German film history, right? So that you know, of course, Metropolis is saturated with white individuals, but then where does race come in Metropolis? Well, they are you know, and of course, whiteness is also racialized here in different ways, but in this case, we have Afro-Germans who are serving as ornamentation, and this practice would of course continue through the colonial films of the Nazi era. Then we have FP1 Doesn't Reply, which is a film about an emergency on a vast supercarrier and communications platform in the Atlantic. And it thematizes aircraft and radio technologies as a means to connect the world. And actually, this was definitely film designed. It was thought, okay, this is going to be a film that will bring together everybody. 1932, you know, in a nice communications utopia. But of course, they're utterly indifferent to any parts of the world that are not North America or specifically Western Europe. So these films all envision modernity as a distinctly white European male project, excluding or abjecting others that would deny this thesis. But gradually, of course, after the fall of the Third Reich, that began to change, and in East Germany in particular, non-white bodies go from being ornamentation to signifiers of the future, because of course, under a socialist ideology, there will be more and more solidarity between all nations, and so non-white professionals of all kinds will meet in the same space with the white professionals from the Eastern European context. And Silent Star is the first spaceship exploration film that has a multiracial cast, and it was shot in East Germany. Star Trek was much later. So there was a sort of second order awareness of multiculturalism so the first order awareness is, oh, these Black people are there, therefore we must be further in the future because there aren't any currently on our space crews. But the second order awareness is that it's itself ideologically imposed by the state, and this is a problem that East Germany had throughout its entire duration, that if you saw diverse people, it meant that they were there as students or as other in other forms, you know, at the behest of the state and at the mercy of the state, and therefore somewhat suspect, which gives the skinheads in the 80s particular room to maneuver. And I do like that Paul mentioned the resurgence of racial racial theory in the early 80s, because I can confirm that also with this corpus of films. So in West Germany, by the early 80s, and this is Aubrey Pankey, who's an American exile in East Germany, trained opera singer who winds up playing bit parts in East German films because he can play the Black guy, and he's not happy about this. In 1982, Kamikaze 1989, it is Fassbinder's last acting role before he dies, but also Günther Kaufmann, you can see him in the upper left-hand corner, is used sort of as a signifier of the increasingly diverse, but also, again, pessimistically on the decline West German society, dominated by surveillance, cheap entertainment, and general vice. And so Günther Kaufmann is both a very competent and good police officer and also a non-white signifier of some sort of decline, unmarked, etc. But this doesn't lead us necessarily to anywhere except for the very complicated and interlaced history of German whiteness and racialization within their own science fiction corpus. What I want to do is focus in on these three films, again, they made right after the financial crisis of 2008 to 2009. And those would be Transfer, and I chose a particularly telling moment. And I chose these three films also because I feel like they encapsulate the left, the center, and the right wing political spectrum. So here, transfer I would put on the left wing, where this is a dystopian film about a corporation that can transfer minds into other bodies, and so elderly white people can then get their minds transferred into young, healthy Black bodies. And we can see from the quote even here within the corporation that this woman from the corporation says Blacks have an advantage. Our Earth is getting hotter, and we're vulnerable. The white people are vulnerable. They're more resistant. And this is, of course, part of this kind of a racialized logic that's been hinted at about the composition of refugees and the composition of non-white bodies in sort of European contexts. The other two movies, we have Hell, which is a film from 2011, definitely post-apocalyptic, about how by 2016 the Earth's temperature would have risen 10 degrees and everything is so hot and there's no resources, and so everyone must go after each other in a war of all against all, resembling Cormac McCarthy's The Road, which had come out in the theaters in 2009 as a film adaptation, as well as kind of the Purge and the war of all against all. And finally, The Coming Days from 2010. Now, why did I choose the financial crisis? This is a particular moment of helplessness that Aidan actually alluded to earlier, in which the whole apparatus of Europe was endangered. And Europe, of course, as envisioned by the EU, is a certain type of white project. It could have not been, but it was in its outcome. Given to a certain unassumed whiteness that has now had a decade worth of consequences. And I would, of course, if you're looking for larger explanations around this, I would recommend, of course, Cedric Durand's work, Mackenzie work on Capitalism is Dead. But I'm not going to go into it a lot further. What I'm very interested, of course, is how do these films that are suddenly, confronting this catastrophe in each case, what clues do they offer us for our own survival, and also, what are these moments of helplessness towards determining the future and or taking a certain level of agency into one's hands to change things? How does that break down? And again, there's an inherent pessimism to the German sci-fi cinema, so there's no easy answer to that. So let's start with Transfer. Transfer tells this tale of a rich elderly couple, Hermann and Anna, who spend €1 million apiece to have their minds transferred into the healthy bodies of African migrants, Apollon and Sarah, although they are more employees than migrants. So the deal is they get to occupy Apollon and Sarah's minds during the day, and the body's original owners get to have their minds back for 4 hours every night. Apollon and Sarah have agreed to this bargain in exchange for family remittances in Africa, but quickly discover that they are also placed under constant surveillance, and they're at this island getaway in Lake Constance that's more or less a gilded prison. Apollon and Sarah, nevertheless, learn how to bypass all the security measures and sabotage the fragile process that keeps the white German minds in their bodies. Then Sarah and Anna eventually becomes pregnant with Apollon / Hermann's child, and the Africans hatch a scheme that would then give them total control over Hermann and Anna's consciousnesses. That is to say, they would get control back of their own bodies, but be really rich in this Lake Constance getaway and have their own kid. But Menzana monitors them, they get caught, and the consciousnesses are repressed again. Hermann and Anna, and this is the moment of white agency, they seek to buy their own body's freedom, right? This is a direct slavery analog, and they try to get them back from the corporation, but they are denied. They are then, returned to their own bodies, which is different from the original Barceló comic. And Hermann unintentionally dies during the transfer process. Anna struggles, then dying, walking down an empty corridor. There is not Yeah, here we have Anna, near death after Hermann is is deceased, and so their attempt at rebellion fails, and Apollon and Sarah are then brainwashed and are become available for new hosts. So as a dystopian melodrama, Transfer ultimately focalizes around the feelings and decisions undertaken by Hermann and Anna, though as Cheryl Vint has pointed out, the film, quote, portrays with complexity and sympathy both sides of this fetishized exchange. Priscilla Lane's analysis of the film through the lens of Afro-pessimism yields the insight that it operates very much on the quote unquote tension between characters' desire for and disgust at Black bodies, end quote. So if the Black body had been used in the earlier 20th century to chart a path from sort of colonial race relations to a more multicultural society in both East Germany and in West Germany, what we're seeing here is the transition from what David Theo Goldberg would call a racist state to a racial state, in which neoliberal capital benefits from the persistence of marginalized Black bodies and the wealthy white elite seeing only the use value of these bodies. So it's not like, race is the absolute determiner here, but global racism makes things available and convenient suddenly for capitalism. So they're intertwined. Notably, if we're talking about apocalypse, this is a dystopian film. So the apocalypse is elsewhere. It's in Africa. It's not here in Lake Constance, and that is extremely important in considering what we're dealing with here. It's an off-screen pressure that never quite goes away. So we see sort of white helplessness between intertwined corporate and white racial hegemonies, even when the privileged use their privilege to resist. It's pretty bleak, but that's, again, the whole corpus. If we look at Hell, this is a post-apocalyptic film that then becomes a dystopian film, because suddenly, they get taken in by a murder family, and the murder family has their own weird order. And when I say they, it is a small family unit, Marie and her sister Leonie and her boyfriend Philip, trying to survive. They meet Tom, who's a mechanic, and they, again, are just barely kind of scavenging from gas stations and whatnot. There's very little water, and they are ambushed at one point, wind up in this kind of cursed Bauernhof with this murder family, and of course this is this sort of bog standard centrist, I would say, vision of the apocalypse. It's inevitable. It's going to happen. Also, there's not a lot we can do about it, which is, again, moving away from the left to the center. There can't really be racism here because there's only antagonism among white people. There are no people of color left in this Europe. There just aren't there. And this sort of helplessness of the earlier generations, let everything go to hell, and so to hell, which of course is the title, and hell means like light in the adjective light in German, not Hölle, which is the Christian hell, and of course that play is the genre fiction title. But of course, this is all about coming up with justifications to murder other humans on screen, and this kind of washed out, overexposed quality is the horror, right? Or sort of like Midsummer, where horrors are perpetrated in broad daylight rather than in the darkness. Moving on to Coming Days, and I really am going to emphasize, Coming Days is a sprawling text in some ways. It has lots of problems, but basically it's a family drama, just like with Paul's text, set between the years 2012 to 2020, as another oil war grips the Middle East, and this time with more direct European involvement. That is to say, Europeans directly send troops. The Cooper family, who are portrayed right here on the slides. We have Philip on the left, and Cecilia, and then Laura. And they are gradually torn apart. Laura gets involved with this near-blind birder played by Daniel Brühl, who quits his job due to some macular degeneration, and eventually, due to the civil unrest in Europe, kind of winds up in his own Swiss cabin off outside of a literal fortress that has been built around Europe in the Alps. And at that point, of course, this estranges Hans from Laura, but, and this is the kicker, Laura shacks up with Constantine, who is Cecilia's revolutionary left boyfriend, and Constantine is very jealous and eventually comes down to pursue his child, or what he sees as his child, and Laura, when Laura goes to find Hans, who is near blind and living in this cabin outside of Fortress Europe. And of course, at the beginning, they literally, they say it right there, the rest of Europe has become fortress to ward off the African refugees. They have Frontex guards in this fortress, and Laura asks, how dangerous is it beyond the wall? And they say, well, every week there are, and then they use a very antiquated racial slur, jigaboos or bimbos, as they said, and then they also use the racial slur kafa, and then of course, then Laura, as a white woman, says, "Oh, I'm afraid to go over this border, but I will go further." And of course, you're like, "Well, is it the migrants that are the biggest threat?" But of course, this is a very interesting scenario at the end where Hans, the near-blind Hans, played by Daniel Brühl, is living with Albert, who is a French-speaking African refugee, and also a boy who is able to do violence to other people. Very important. So Laura comes, brings her child, and also brings trouble. Constantine pursues them, and of course, Daniel Brühl is like, nope, are the refugees a problem? No, I have Albert. I have my own refugee who knows how to kill people. And this is, of course, at the moment when Constantine comes to fetch his child. We can see off in the distance Albert with his rifle, and then we have a rifle's eye view at Constantine. Later, after Constantine sets the cabin on fire, we have to get to that point. He's only able to set the cabin on fire because Laura still trusts him, which is a bad decision, because then he takes advantage of it, shoots Hans, and then it's up to Albert to slit Constantine's throat while he's getting in his car to take them away. So Laura instigates the tragedy at the end, but cannot resolve the consequences thereof, which is sort of inherent sexism underlying her portrayal here. So what I want to do is link the long legacy of pessimistic German sci-fi cinema with this particular recent history of sci-fi films made in the wake of the global financial crisis of 2008, 2009, with a focus on the perceived agency of the white German protagonist. In Transfer, an elderly white German couple recognizes their own complicity in structural racialized oppression through their literal occupation of Black minds and bodies. Their story's climax involves the acceptance of free agency of these Black subjects and a white savior attempt to rescue them, only to find all their efforts end in failure against a corporation that seems to wield the real agency here. In Hell, we have Marie, Leonie, and Tom struggling to survive against the backdrop of resource scarcity and a total breakdown in all structures in Europe, a scorched landscape, and murderous fellow Europeans, white Europeans. Their story's climax involves the murder of and temporary escape from a family of murderous fellow white Germans, but then they have to just continue that life, trying to endure, and they have diminished hopes. In the coming days, the Cooper family slowly pulls apart, with geopolitical instability jeopardizing all of the family's future prospects. And the story's climax, of course, happens because of her unintentional, opening up of her family to Constantine, only for Constantine to betray her. And so an ever lethal African migrant, Albert, kills the main villain, and then he says, "Okay, I'm good. I've killed this guy," and he's standing this like right next to a cabin that's on fire, so he can't live there because he doesn't want to confront the Frontex policemen. Like, European border racism is literally more lethal to him than trying to find a new place to survive in the wilderness. So we can certainly read these outcomes in terms of their pessimistic subgenres, which is dystopian fiction, post-apocalyptic fiction, and geopolitical fiction. But what if we see this as a very specific archive of white German feelings on display, feelings to which non-white individuals must attend to in order to survive? And this is where I'm going to be very specific. In Transfer, we learned that white people will will wake up to authoritarian corporate dominance of everything far too late, and that Black people will be under heavier regimes of biopower that will not lend them the same level of societal agency to affect change. So just because white people become woke does not mean that they'll be any more successful than their Black contemporaries at affecting change. In Hell, we learn that the white fantasy of a global warming rack world is actually a social Darwinian struggle in which the good people will have to commit violence against the bad people in order to survive. It's just presumed that all people of color, of course, are gone, leaving the migration stories in the other two films not even remotely in the same universe. In the coming days, we learn that white people will form mutually advantageous alliances with Black people, and that's Hans and Albert, but only so long as the latter will use a capacity for violence to defend them. So only, again, if they have use value. We learn that white people will not take the necessary steps to protect Black people, but white people will definitely, benefit from the selfless courage of Black people they've just met. So if these statements sound a little bit more preposterous, of course, that's the moment where this genre content can be alienated for us to then analyze. So I'm going to stop there and leave you just with Time of the Wolf, Le Temps de Loup, which is about white people waiting at a train station and may suggest another vision of agency during the apocalypse that I'm not going to discuss here. So thank you.
Okay, so since I know we're cutting into our break, I wanted to say if we could get 3 questions, one for each presenter, we could, have a couple of minutes to discuss and then take a short break before our last panel. So if anybody wants to drop a question in the chat or raise their hand. Yes, to get us started off, I can start with a quick question for Paul. Thank you. Those are really interesting stories, and I'd like to hunt them down and read a couple of them. I was thinking some of the attitudes you were talking about in the 70s and 80s about environmentalism reminded me of the attitudes in the 19th century, about man being separated from nature, and how that was tied to like colonial views. So I was wondering, do you see this as a kind of a continuation of these German ideals from the past, or are there any important differences between Romanticism and these environmental views in the late 20th century?
So thanks a lot for that question. And I'm happy to send you actually, I have PDFs of some of these things I could easily send you, at least of the Klotz and the Born. I would say that especially with Sophie Klotz, there's something that reminds me of the Reformbewegung of the late 19th century, early 20th century, in terms of like this idea of like a harm damaging modernity that, needs to be remediated through natural living. Born he draws on like the technology critic Ivan Ilyich actually to kind of criticize Western modernity, and it's very much like a kind of a Herbert Marcuse influenced image of society as an apparatus, but it is nevertheless about the replacement of nature through artifice. But I would say it's really rooted in 20th century intellectual culture, like of the sort of the new left. So I mean, I think that that's really important, interesting question. So thank you for asking that and making me think about it. But and I think that the student movement of the 20th century is related to the 19th century, but there's a lot of discourse that makes its way into Born there. And Michael Springer is, I think, I mean, he's very influenced by Marxist analysis, actually. There's a lot of picking apart of this environmentalist protagonist in terms of his class privileges, and a lot of the ideas of he actually reads Heinrich von Ofterdingen in his spare time, and he is a romantic, and he is inspired by this kind of 19th century image of the wandering poet, but he has his girlfriend, who works for a Catholic hospital that bans labor unions, like gets him to wake up to these other things going on in the world. So yeah, I mean, now that come to think of it, there is a reference to the 19th century in the Browning novel. But thank you again, and it's a good question.
Yeah.
It looks like Cheryl has a question. Sorry, Natasha, I didn't mean to cut you off. Looks like Cheryl has a question, and then Katie, and then we can break.
Thank you, and again, thanks to the panel for some really interesting papers. So my question is for you, Aidan. That was a really excellent paper. I haven't seen that film, but I will see it immediately now. And I wonder if you could say a little bit more about the breakdown of the AI. I don't know if you know Richard Powers' novel, Galatea 2.2, but so in that novel, they're trying to educate an AI, and eventually she too has a breakdown. She gets gendered, it's a long story, but she too has a breakdown, and it's basically because she learns too much about humanity and all the violence that is what humanity's all about, as far as she can tell. And so she just says, like, no thank you, I don't want to engage in intercourse with humans anymore, discourse exchange. So I just wondered, like, what's the story of this AI's breakdown, if anything, and how does that factor into the reading that you offered in the film?
Okay, thank you, Cheryl. What Galaxy? What? I'm ashamed to say I don't know that novel. Galaxy.
Sorry, it's Galatea 2.2.
Sorry. All right.
Oh, maybe no, it's 2.2.
Fantastic.
Sorry, it's Richard Powers' novel.
Cool.
From the 90s, like early 90s, I think.
Cool, thanks, Cheryl. I'll check that out. And thanks for the question. Yeah, I suppose it's a bit so, like in Martinson's poem, right? He's sort of not entirely clear about where this Mima is drawing its images from. He talks about drawing them from across the galaxy, from places we don't know, etc. What they've done in the film is made it more, as I say, more like AI, and so it makes it clear that it draws its images from the collective consciousness of the viewer or the passengers on the ship. It never quite makes clear how it only focuses on the good, but I think the good images as opposed to the bad. But once it becomes aware of gets enough sort of anthropocentric imagery, it literally explodes. Which is, like, again, a slight departure from Martinson's text, because in Martinson's text, the Mima somehow becomes cognizant of the fact that Doris, which is the term he uses for Earth, has exploded. So here instead, it's something slightly different. It's visually relayed as an explosion inside in the room. And within that, then, I mean, all forms of cults sort of flower up around its grave and all this sort of stuff, and all these things sort of happen later. I mean, I'm not 100% certain on how convincing the science is within it, but at the same time, I think it's an interesting way that they adapted to this new sort of communicative situation. You know what I mean? But I think there's another paper there that can be read into, like, reading it as sort of manifestation of the culture industry writ large. But I think that's an argument for another day.
Yeah, thank you.
I believe we had one more question.
Yeah, Katie, did you have a question?
Sure. Thanks again to Priscilla for putting this together. I'm coming at this really completely, I am not at all involved in anything of all this research, and I am so fascinated by it, and I so much appreciate hearing all of your thoughts and opinions. I've furiously written down a million titles. I can't wait to watch all those German ones. And I guess also in this time, I've been so, I know this probably sounds ridiculous, but afraid to watch sci-fi because I feel like I'm living in a dystopian novel, film, you name it, right now. So it's a little just trying to get through my day-to-day and not send my family into, a never-ending spiral of despair. So, so I just really want to say how much I've enjoyed all of your thoughts and opinions and all these different titles and the way they're coming together and rooted in so much of what we're seeing today. I want to come back to Aidan. I really appreciate your links to the EU and sort of this, and of course then in Evan, what you've been saying in Fortress Europe and Frontex and what we're seeing today, and how important that how important film and literature and all of this is in terms of to be able to understand and to figure out what's actually happening. And so I wanted to ask you, Aidan, and of course, anyone, when, of course, when I look at the EU, I'm like you, Aidan, I'm a fan, but I'm a critic, right? This is just, right, there's no question that I think it's a good thing, but at the same time, there are, seriously, there are problems up and down and all around. But at the same time, when I look at what is happening in terms of sustainability and climate in Europe, right, we're looking at a really positive, especially compared to what's happening in the US. Just Paris Accord as an example. So then, the Europeans have this Green Deal, but it's very much about, energy and sustainability and not at all related, there's no mention of climate migration. But of course, then there are other papers about climate migration and the effects and what's happening and the UN and all of these different aspects. But sort of, I don't really see where this is coming together, right? And in terms of policies and where things are actually happening. And of course, we know about Poland and Hungary and Italy and all of these conflicting perspectives and all of this anti-migration, anti-immigrant sentiment and racism and the whiteness, right? All of this is coming through. And then, we have COVID-19 and we have all this talk about, we have to help one another. And yes, it's better talk than what we're getting from here, right? We're actually going to, the EU wants to actually have people have vaccines. Anyway, long story short, what's it going to take, right? How are we going to, how do we move forward with all of this, right? And I hope you have the answers, but I understand that I'm just trying to think about what we're facing and for generations. Thank you so much, really.
Thank you so much for that question. It's funny, actually, because when I started, I wrote a book a couple of years ago on European science fiction. I started off writing about science fiction about a year, and I realized I was essentially writing the news. And so, I mean, it was, but that's another day's work. I mean, the absolute answer to everything, I mean, I honestly have no idea. I mean, okay, if I'm going to be completely honest, I think socialism or barbarism is about what we're faced with. But I think in terms of like collective solutions in the EU, you're very much right to talk about like the Green Deals and so forth. The difficulty is, of course, and I sort of mentioned this in the paper as well, in terms of thinking of the EU as a collective. And so like overall, the headline pictures might be good, but then if you look at specific, I mean, you mentioned Hungary, Poland being another, for example, with huge fossil or coal burning. My own native Ireland, for instance, for all its sort of talk is, absolutely refuses to take on the agricultural industry, for instance, and reduce emissions. So it's always this sort of fudge as I see it right now. I mean, you see it, for instance, with the financial, or with the even the sort of north-south divide that emerged with COVID, for instance, in terms of this sort of order liberal notion of shall we, will we fund the sort of South and all these sort of hugely problematic things. So right now, I mean, to me, it seems the EU is sort of stumbling from sort of fudge to fudge. They're getting by, but these crises, as you sort of mentioned, are just going to continue exponentially. And I think the link specifically to migration is in terms of migration crises. I mean, the numbers coming in, say, to Europe during the migration crisis, for instance. I mean, Germany took over 1 million people. Other countries, including Ireland, took very few. But these numbers are going to be dwarfed by what's coming down the track from the very same regions that Europe, through unequal trading agreements and so forth, are actually perpetuating these things. And I think the difficulty is that there's no real official acknowledgement of this, because I think it's partially to do with and I'll actually pass this on to Evan now, actually, maybe, but I think it is partially to do with national sort of concerns with national, here in the UK, they talk of, in the history curriculums, they talk about the benefits of colonialism and so forth. And the EU is very reluctant to have another domino fall, basically. So I think they're reluctant to push much more than they are. Sorry, Evan, I wonder what you think.
Well, yeah, so one thing I'm trying to do is confront the question of agency, which even though you think, oh, why confront some like B grade telepool film that someone's going to show at like 11 p.m. on some German network. Surprisingly, in these times, people turn to bad genre fiction for their metaphors, for all kinds of explanatory power, and of course, lurking behind that is pernicious, visual and textual moves such as overpopulation or naturalization of the murder of Africans at the European border, both in the Mediterranean and elsewhere. So one thing I think in terms of sort of agency is a openness to listen to people who are not in seats of power. But these genre films, as I show in my own research, are nationally subsidized to a degree that even would make Americans and Canadians blush. The Germans subsidize their film industry, and they subsidize crap, a lot of it. And I love watching the crap, but I also want to remind people that philosophically a lot of it is very vacant, and so you then can read lots of naturalized national and European ideology there, and that's where much of our ideas of what can white people do actually come from, is from this genre fiction, rather than, I think, sitting down and saying philosophically and ethically, where do I sit on these issues, which require maybe a different form of thinking and different texts.
Thank you. I'd just like to thank our speakers again, and of course our audience who took part in this panel. So thanks everyone. Thank you to our speakers again. And Priscilla, I'll let you have the last word.
Yes, yeah, thanks again to everyone. Thank you, Paul, for already sending me those PDFs. We're going to take a 5-minute break, so we'll get started with the last panel at 3:15. The last panel is on teaching sci-fi and fantasy, and Adana will be moderating. So, just feel free to turn off your cameras, check your news feed, and we'll see you in 5 minutes.
Welcome back. We'll now be starting with panel 4, which is entitled Pedagogical Approaches to Sci-fi and Intersectionality. Thank you all for joining us today. This is our last panel. Because we have so many speakers here, I'll be introducing the speakers before each of their talks so that it's easier to keep track. And we'll now be joined by Dr. Renee Alexander-Craft, who is Associate Professor in the UNC Department of Communication. For the past 17 years, Dr. Alexander-Craft's research and creative projects have centered on an Afro-Latin community located in the small coastal town of Portobello, Panama, who call themselves and their carnival performance tradition Congo. She has completed both a manuscript and digital humanities project which reflect this focus. The first is an ethnographic monograph entitled When the Devil Knocks, the Congo Tradition and the Politics of Blackness in the 20th century Panama. And the second project is entitled Digital Portobello, Art, Scholarship. This is an interactive online collection of ethnographic interviews, photos, videos, artwork, and archival material that illuminate the rich cultural and history of Portobello. Broadly, her research and teaching examine the relationship among socio-historical constructions of Blackness, Black cultural performance, and discourses of Black inclusion and exclusion within a hemispheric American framework. Her talk is entitled Afrofuturism, Ethical World Traveling, and Holding a Space for Difference.
Thank you. It'll just take me one little second to put you all where I need you to be so I can see you well, and then put my remarks where they need to be. As always, getting used to doing this with our technology right now. So I just want to thank you all, start by thanking you all by allowing me to join you today. So many interesting conversations. I want to share a little bit again from the abstract and use that as a way to launch into some of the questions that are really animating my talk today. It's funny, I messaged Priscilla as we were getting started for a reminder of how long we had so I could put a timer on myself and be a good steward today. As I share in the abstract, really looking at migration, world traveling, ideological as well as physical, and navigating difference, these are persistent themes in science fiction. Black speculative artists and Afrofuturism, futurist often engage with these themes from a Black worldview and through characters who give readers and audience members a chance to navigate and interrogate structures of power through their perspectives. My presentation today will focus on how teaching these works through an anti-racism framework can help students build critical capacities in understanding race and racism as constructed technologies of value and control that can be imagined and remade otherwise. Doing so also highlights the ways in which curiosity, empathy, and imagination are key to any kind of liberatory movement. So reflecting on some of the conference's themes and leaning into some of those around especially identity and difference, I decided to focus on kind of three overarching questions. One is, what does it mean to commit to using Afrofuturism as a means to teach ethical world traveling? What does it require to facilitate and engage in this type of travel? How do we create classroom and school environments that promote political and cultural world traveling as ongoing processes of empathetic witnessing, wonder, and responsibility? How do we do so? Leaning into respect. The third is, how do we engage in these practices of inclusion and equity as processes of ethical bridge building from a place of openness and joy, as a kind of work we get to do and not something we have to do? So in short, how can we use leaning into literatures about Afrofuturism, Black speculative fiction, and teaching from an anti-racist perspective to create better structures to teach and learn from diverse humans, as diverse humans, in ways that give us all the capacity to do better? The title, again, of the talk is Afrofuturism, Ethical World Traveling and Holding a Space for Difference. I gravitate toward the notion of holding a space because the act of holding requires intentionality, patience, tension, and grace. It requires an openness to be uncomfortable, at least for a little while. And it anticipates that something desirable will be there at the end. It's process-oriented and it demands an engaged presence. And it also is a practice of hopefulness. So the way I want to kind of guide us through the talk today, I want to kind of get a moment to talk through, I know you all have done some talking through this already, but a little bit about Afrofuturism and where I come from, what I pull from in animating my classes that way. A little bit about anti-racism and what I lean into in terms of definitions of anti-racism and anti-racist. What do I mean by world traveling and what does ethical world traveling look like? And then with those as kind of a framework, I want to get to share, and I'll, if there is the opportunity to do so, I'd like to do a shared screen to just show 3 excerpts from 3 syllabi and talk through how it is these intentions and how it is this framework goes into the 3 different courses intended for first-year students, students who are at the junior, senior level, and then more senior students. And reflect on one particular assignment that my students just submitted yesterday that really kind of, I think, does some of this work and pushes it forward. So I want to start with about Afrofuturism. So as Ytasha Womack states in her wonderful text, Afrofuturism, the World of Sci-Fi and Fantasy Culture, Afrofuturism, quote, Afrofuturism is an intersection of imagination, technology, the future, and liberation, end quote. She continues, quote, both an artistic, aesthetic, and a framework for critical theory, Afrofuturism combines elements of science fiction, historical fiction, speculative fiction, fantasy, Afrocentricity, and magical realism with non-Western beliefs. Coined by cultural critic Mark Derry in a 1994 essay titled Black to the Future, and expanded by an interdisciplinary collective of students, artists, scholars, and science fiction fans through an online discussion group facilitated by Alondra Nelson in the late 1990s, the term provides a convenient container to think of thinking and praxis that predicated it by centuries. As Guardian columnist Stephen Thrasher contends, quote, racism can give Black Americans the impression that in the past we were only slaves who did not rebel, that in the present we are a passive people beaten by police who cannot fight back, and that in the future we simply do not exist, end quote. So Afrofuturism then is a mechanism to resist the intellectual and psychological domestication of such thinking by examining racism itself as a technology, amplifying stories of Black powerfulness, spaciousness, and mobility, and centering stories of Black innovation and inspiration, and viewing successful Black futurity as both normative and inevitable. And I think that last piece is of utmost importance. You know, how is it and why is it that it is a radical act to view Black futurity as both normative and inevitable? And I think being able to center from that perspective is really important. So that's my entry into and the foundation I use with my students for Afrofuturism. In terms of anti-racism, I'm always really inspired by and I'm compelled to lean into Ibram X. Kendi's definition that he posits in his text, How to Be an Anti-Racist. So he talks about anti-racism. Anti-racism is defined as the work of actively opposing racism by advocating for changes in political, economic, and social life. Anti-racism tends to be an individualized approach and set up in opposition to individual racist behaviors and impacts. Anti-racist is someone who is supporting an anti-racist policy through their actions and expressing anti-racist ideas. This includes the expression and ideas that racist groups are equals and none needs developing and in supporting policies that reduce racial inequity. So thinking about those two things as a framework, two of the legs of kind of a three-legged tool. So Afrofuturism, anti-racism, and then the third is a notion of world traveling. So this third piece, I lean into a brilliant 1994 essay entitled Playfulness, World Traveling, and Loving Perception by feminist philosopher Maria Lugones, where she discusses world traveling as what I would call a method of ideological bridge building. It means traveling between worlds of comfort, familiarity, and support to worlds of difference, unfamiliarity, and alienation in ways that embrace at least accept vulnerability as part of the process. It also means practicing kindness, consideration, good manners, and respect as we learn and rehearse new mannerisms and norms. Lugones calls this kind of ethical code switching an ability to approach difference with what she calls loving perception. This is not necessarily a sentimental kind of love, but more a practice of agape that appreciates and values the work of others. So one of the reasons this is very important to me, and I love Lugones's conception of this, is because oftentimes we get a notion of code switching and this kind of discussion of world traveling in a way that puts communities of color at a deficit. Instead, she talks about this as kind of a superpower, that communities of color have had to practice ethical world traveling to stay alive as a mode of survival, as well as a mode of integration into various societies. So our goal as educators and our goal in creating pedagogies that allow all students to kind of practice this is to give students who would not necessarily have this opportunity because of their positionality to do so. So it is pushing against the notion of arrogant world traveling and leaning into the notion of a kind of ethical, loving perception and world traveling. And so how do we kind of do this? How do we kind of get into this work? And part of it really starts with kind of as educators and teachers ourselves, understanding our own positionality and doing reflexive work about that notion of positionality. I want to, in the interest of time, I want to kind of, now that we have the three-legged stool of kind of what inspires me in some of the courses that I'm teaching around this, I want to think about, so how do we use our pedagogical practices, which are inspired by Afrofuturism and animated by practices of anti-racism, to promote political and cultural world traveling as ongoing processes of empathetic witnessing and wonder as responsibility and respect. And to do so, part of it is starting with this notion of resisting domestication in our own syllabi and in our own coursework, so that we examine them with an eye toward anti-racism. How can we make space for voices that aren't currently there? How can we use the worldviews and the ethnicities represented in a lot of the speculative fiction and sci-fi as a way to give students an opportunity to rehearse empathizing with, understanding systems of power that are extracted from our own, and then using that to really be able to short circuit some of the systems of power that they move through, in their everyday lives. And I want to say more about that just by uplifting pieces of 3 syllabi. Is it possible for me to do a screen share? Is that possible?
Hold on. I can try to give you permission to do that.
If not, I can talk through.
I think you should be able to. Yes, you can.
So Dr. Croft, you are a co-host, so you should be able to share your screen.
Perfect, thank you. You all can see this now? Okay. Yes. All right, so I wanted to just share a little bit. I adapted pieces of 3 different syllabi that I kind of wanted to walk through in terms of how I want to engage in this work. This one is from a course I'm currently teaching. This is the, I think, 3rd or 4th time I've taught this as a first-year seminar. And it's a course on African American literature that I'm teaching through a focus on what I call the Black Fantastic. And I use the Black Fantastic as a container to hold Black sci-fi, speculative fiction. Some of it is horror, and some of it is folk tales, but folk tales which do the work that fits within an Afro-futuristic framework. So this first one, I'll just share for each of them kind of the guiding overview and some of the questions that animate it, and then give you a peek at some of the assignments that I'm using in each of them. So for this one, the guiding framework: what if Black pirates raided European slave ships to liberate enslaved Africans? What if African Americans could time travel? What if the most powerful being the world had ever seen were a Black woman, or a Black woman vampire or telepath? Those what ifs fit within a genre called Black speculative fiction and Black speculative arts, focused on Black speculative fiction, fantasy, horror, and sci-fi, written by Black diaspora authors. This seminar challenges students to think critically and creatively about modern structures of race and racism. Using historical and theoretical readings to guide us, we'll travel to the worlds these authors create, seeking to understand the workings of race there, and return to our contemporary context to reflect and critique what we have witnessed here. How do understandings of race and racism in these worlds help us engage with structures of race and racism in ours? what racial logics motivate the main characters and the socio-political movements of which they are a part. And so that's part of what really animates this one. And I know that my time is getting short, so I'll walk through these rather quickly. So giving just a quick look at some of the way the assignments are structured, the point of these assignments is to give students a toe in the water of what do we mean by Afrofuturism? What is visionary fiction? How does a notion toward Afrofuturism and this kind of thinking inspire any kind of social movement? How is the imagination a tool for liberation? And this is really important to me for first-year students who have come out of the kinds of K through 12 programs now that are so test-driven that they often don't get the same kinds of opportunities to lean into imagination and to look at imagination as a productive and valuable tool in any work that you do. And not just a hobby or an aside, right? So that's one of the main things here. And each of the stories they read, they get to see a character, a protagonist who is, and often I choose to focus on young women protagonists, young women of color protagonists who are in positions where they are facing structures that limit their mobility because of their gender, that limit their mobility because of their ethnicity, and they have to use the tools at their disposal to subvert those. And I'm going to come back to this briefly in a moment, but I just wanted to give a quick peek at these others. The next is an upper level course, Race, Ethnicity, and Performance, Sci-Fi, Afrofuturism, and Reimagining Power. What this one does that the first year seminar doesn't do but points toward is now really puts theories, Black feminist theories, theories that come from Black feminist geography, theories about race and racism in conversation with fictional stories that feature Black protagonists and often Black female protagonists who are engaged in some of this work. And so as I list here, the questions that are driving the inquiry are, what is the difference between race and ethnicity? What difference does that difference make? What do writers of Black speculative fiction call attention to? How do they call attention to the hegemony of our racial consciousness that's informed by gender, region, and ethnicity through their work? What new possibilities or taken for granted knowledge become visible or sayable? And so those are some of the questions that really animate that one. And with the same kind of focusing on putting now it's not just uplifting the fiction and giving us a chance to engage that. Because I come from a performance background, I'm using performance scholarship to have students actually put this on their bodies and figure out how do we script these texts, how do I put them on my body, and what did putting them on my body and having to say those words coming from my positionality do to challenge some of my preconceived notions and norms. And we make space to talk about those things in the class. And the last is a course that I got to teach with Joseph Meikle and Toshi Regan this past spring, which we'll redo in the fall, which put Ta-Nehisi Coates' The Water Dancer in conversation with the 1619 Project and Christina Sharp's In the Wake. So using kind of the theories of In the Wake, using the history and the notion that this history was accessible through current event, right? Accessible through the New York Times, putting that in conversation with Ta-Nehisi Coates' Water Dancer, thinking about the structures of race and racism in a plantation economy and the ways in which kind of hope, belief, trust, family, and memory can help do work that we might get to talk about as magical, but the magic of that is really mundane. So it's a way to talk about the structures of power, as well as to talk about the ways in which memory and story make other possibilities work. I want to stop there for now in the interest of time. And then if there's time and question and answer, I'll talk through the specific exercise that my students just did in performance that I thought really brought some of these together well.
So thank you, Dr. Kraft, for this fascinating and very insightful talk. We now have 3 speakers who will present together. They are Dr. Michelle Tracy Berger, Dr. Courtney Woods, and Dr. Priscilla Lang. Dr. Michelle Tracy Berger is Associate Professor in the Department of Women's and Gender Studies at UNC Chapel Hill, and the former Director of the Faculty Fellows Program at UNC's Institute for the Arts and Humanities. Her teaching and research interests include multiracial feminisms, qualitative methods, and HIV/AIDS activism. Her latest book, Transforming Scholarship: Why Women's and Gender Studies Students Are Changing Themselves and the World, definitively answers the question, what can you do with an interest in women's and gender studies? The book argues that not only are women's and gender studies graduates able to find fulfilling employment, they also comprise an emerging vanguard of knowledge and producers in the US and globally, and maintain a strong commitment to gender equality and social justice after graduation. Dr. Courtney Woods is Assistant Professor of Environmental Sciences and Engineering at the UNC Gillings School of Public Health. Dr. Woods applies community-driven approaches in order to understand the impacts of industrial pollution and solid waste on communities of color. She is also a co-founder of a POC-led cooperative called the Earth Seedland Collective. She is a recipient of the Steve Wing International Environmental Justice Award and the Newton Underwood Award for Excellence in Teaching from the UNC Department of Environmental Sciences and Engineering. Her most recent publication is entitled Modeling Drug and Chemical-Induced Hepatotoxicity with Systems Biology Approaches. Together with Dr. Berger, she will also speak with Dr. Priscilla Lang. Dr. Lang is Associate Professor of German at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Her most recent work, Out of This World, Afro-German Afrofuturism, focuses on Afro-German authors' use of Afrofuturist concepts in literature and theater. Her first book, entitled White Rebels in Black, German Appropriation of Black Popular Culture, was published with the University of Michigan Press in 2018. In addition to these projects, the broader themes she's interested in are German national identity, conceptions of race, self and the other in Germany, cross-racial empathy, post-colonialism, and rebellion. In our third speaker with, okay. They will now present a talk altogether entitled A Transdisciplinary Approach to Teaching Sci-Fi.
Thank you, Adina. Here, I'm just going to get our PowerPoint started. 1 second. Okay, so Michelle, Courtney, and I conceived of this course as an opportunity to discuss environmental issues with students through the lens of science fiction and paying particular attention to intersectionality. Thus, the main focus of the course was asking how the genre of science fiction, primarily in film but also in literature, has been used to address the world's environmental concerns and how these concerns affect characters differently depending on their gender, race, and class. Using this lens, we investigated long-standing global environmental challenges, including water shortages, overpopulation, consumption, and climate change. And here's a list of the topics we covered and the films we screened. One of the biggest logistical issues was how to co-teach a course as 3 professors from very different disciplines, myself coming from German Studies, Michelle from Women and Gender Studies, and Courtney from Environmental Studies and Engineering. This course is part of the new III initiative at UNC, which stands for Ideas, Information, and Inquiry, and describes classes that are meant to give freshmen an introduction to the research of different disciplines. Rather than viewing the seminar as being a comprehensive crash course in all of our disciplines, which would have been impossible, instead we focused on key tools of analysis from our disciplines that we wanted students to learn. I represented the sci-fi and film studies side, so I led students through discussions about what sci-fi is as a genre and what its different subgenres are. But I have to add that Michelle is also an expert on sci-fi and even has a sci-fi novel that you should all read. I also helped them learn the ins and outs of film analysis, including paying attention to formalist attributes like lighting, sound, photography, and costumes. Michelle introduced them to a few key concepts in women's and gender studies, most importantly intersectionality, but also subjugated knowledge, about which she will say more later. Finally, for each unit, Courtney gave students the basics for understanding complex environmental problems, as well as provided them with case studies and helped them develop their scientific thinking. In this way, we were successfully able to provide an introduction to key concepts across the social sciences, humanities, and natural sciences that help students better understand environmental issues. We found the course attracted a variety of students from those just interested in sci-fi to biology majors and women's studies majors. The class was also diverse in terms of gender and ethnicity. The two films we will discuss with you today are two short films we used, Pumzi, which is perhaps more well known, and The Sixth World. We chose these films for the course because not only did they present fantasies of how to deal with environmental problems in the future, but they also featured female heroines who were people of color, which we felt was important for helping challenge students' expectations of sci-fi. Pumzi is a Kenyan film directed by Wanuri Kahiu. It was screened at the 2010 Sundance Film Festival as part of its New African Cinemas program. The film is set in the future, we are told 35 years after World War III, or the Water War. The location is the Maitu community in East Africa, surrounded by a desert landscape. We soon learned that in this world, both water and energy are incredibly scarce, so much so that humans are needed to power the grid by laboring on exercise bikes and treadmills. After such a session, they must wring out the sweat in their clothes and save their urine to be filtered back into drinking water. This is a society in which nothing can be taken for granted. We are not told how things have become so dire, and as far as we know, nothing exists outside of this East African society. The main action in the film revolves around Asha, a Maitu woman who is the curator of the Virtual Natural History Museum. I'll get back to that. One day she receives an anonymous package with a soil sample. She tests the soil and finds no radiation and a high level of moisture, which would indicate that life may have returned outside the community, something confirmed in a vision she has. But in order to search for the source of this sample, she needs permission from the Maitu Council to leave the community, a request they deny because they doubt her vision. Nevertheless, with the help of a female bathroom attendant, she's able to break out of the compound and go out to plant the tree, which she gives her last bit of water. In the final shot, we see a tree growing rapidly out of Asha's body. The second film, The Sixth World, was written and directed by Nanoba Becker, who is Dene, and a Native American. The film is considered a kind of origin story that asks, quote, does a Navajo prophecy hold the key to humanity's future, end quote. The film centers around a Navajo female astronaut named Tazba Redhouse, who is preparing to go on a mission in space together with a white male scientist who seeks to test whether his genetically engineered corn can grow successfully in space. Prior to boarding the spaceship, a Navajo elder gives her corn from their people. Prior to leaving, Tazba has a dream that presages trouble on the mission. This premonition becomes true when days into the flight, the genetically engineered corn begins to fail. Luckily, Tazba has the ancient corn from her elder, and she's able to plant those seeds to help her and the scientists survive the flight. And now I will give it over to Courtney, who will discuss how these films relate to some of the environmental problems we discussed in class.
All right, thanks. Priscilla, I hope you have the latest version of the slides, because I didn't realize you were going to open them up on PowerPoint as opposed to on the Google Doc.
I downloaded them at like 3 o'clock, or no, sorry. Yeah, around 3 o'clock.
Okay, this should hopefully be the latest version. So in terms of some of the themes that we talked about, environmental health themes that we talked about in the course, this last film that Priscilla describes, Sixth World, there's certainly themes of food security and feeding a growing population, concerns about environmental contaminants like pesticides, and the potential impact of genetically modified foods on both environmental or ecosystems as well as in humans. I thought that it would be interesting to note or highlight that this concern with BT crops is one that was just recently in the news. So for folks who listen to NPR, you may recall recently hearing that BT crops are losing their power. And there are a couple of graphs here that show essentially the sort of increase in use of BT crops over the past 20 plus years, and the steady decline in use of insecticides. And so that certainly speaks to the importance for us in terms of the importance of this particular genetically modified crop, and the benefit to farmers that the use of BT as a genetic modification had, both in terms of reducing their use of insecticides and just allowing them to spend less and require less equipment for tending to their acreage. So I think I should make the connection that the science fiction films have the capacity to be very prescient in terms of predicting things, predicting environmental challenges and crises that we may have. And so the Sixth World, I think, was one example to demonstrate that, this idea that GM crops might be of concern, but that they also, in the end, would sort of lose some of their potency. So this was, this particular theme wasn't one that we talked about in the class, because when we showed this film, we were orienting the students to film studies and gender studies. But again, I think I wanted to highlight that this is an issue that we're dealing with right now and that's relevant to that film. Can I navigate the slides, or do you have to? Thanks. So in terms of Pumsey, I think that is a film that highlighted issues with water insecurity. So I think I remember reading that the director was inspired to produce the film out of frustration for purchasing bottled water. And we know commodification of water has increased significantly over the past several decades as a result of fears of water insecurity and water contamination. And so this map essentially highlights the evidence that we have in terms of water security and water stress globally. We know it's a serious environmental issue that's largely driven by climate change, and one that we anticipate is going to become more severe over the next several decades as we see greater impacts from climate change. So when we talked about these sorts of topics with the students, one of the goals of the course was to enhance data literacy. So I wanted to make sure that I was providing a range of different types of depictions of data for the students, both in terms of spatial depictions like maps. If you go to the next slide. We also discussed this particular topic in terms of looking at who has access to water globally, and using a sort of equity lens to understand how various parts of the world are dealing with water insecurity, and which countries have more or less water insecurity. This example here that we presented in class both shows access to water and improved water infrastructure, but also sanitation, because access to water and sanitation infrastructure, those things sort of go hand in hand, and they also contribute significantly to disease and mortality. It's the leading cause of death and morbidity among children under 5 worldwide. So WASH and access to water infrastructure is really important. And so we, again, with the theme of sort of enhancing data literacy, and also making sure that we talk about communities and regions, so sort of making sure that we look at these issues both globally and also domestically, and so which communities are most severely impacted, and thinking about those not just in terms of difference, but in terms of inequity. So this was one example of exploring inequities in water and water access, water and sanitation access. We also, next slide. So both in thinking about water insecurity and quality, both globally, we also talked about inequities within country. So while we didn't have data for Kenya, where PUMSI was based, we did have data from Ethiopia to see that there are clear inequities by wealth in terms of, or by income in terms of who has access. So this data for each of these quintiles, we're looking at the changes in these various water sources, and the water sources are colored. So over roughly a decade period, and how those changed based on income. So what we see, if you look on the far right, the very dark color at the bottom is piped water on the premises. So clearly folks who are in the highest wealth category have much greater access to piped water, and that and the change in their access over the last over the decade was most significant in that group versus any of the other groups. So this allowed us to understand both the inequities that exist, but also that even when we think about interventions, those interventions aren't necessarily targeting those who are most in need. And in this case, it'd be the poorest 20%. So the slope, or the way that the degree to which those blue shaded colors are changing over the 10 years is less than for some of the other richer or more wealthy groups. And then I think my last slide, again, just offers another sort of data visualization that is more a sort of domestic example. Some of the films that we talked about focused on urbanization, and so we wanted to make sure we talked about racial inequities in terms of who gets to occupy certain spaces, certain places. We talked about how financial markets such as housing markets and laws and policies, land redevelopment projects influence how people are distributed within space. In public health, we spend a lot of time talking about racial residential segregation, bioracism as an important determinant of the quality of neighborhood environment and the resulting health outcomes. And so, we offered some opportunities to talk about some of those historical policies and how they shape the neighborhood environments in which communities of color live, and the sorts of environmental hazards that they might also be exposed to as a result of racist zoning policies and other practices.
So
Hello.
Michelle?
Yep. Hello, everyone. I just want to say I'm so delighted to be here in this conference space with you all. So briefly, we wanted them, and these are first year students, so we wanted them to think about knowledge production. Who gets to know, who gets to theorize, who gets to shape ideas about the environment, and who gets represented on the screen. And we wanted to think about issues of vulnerability, how is knowledge presented, and how do we link different ways of knowing? So that was a really big task. So we started actually with subjugated knowledges, the idea that there are disqualified knowledges and naive knowledges coming out of Foucault, and really kind of having them think about what are the knowledges that are under the radar, so to speak, and how do we think critically about them? And just I'll say briefly about when we think about the sixth world, some of our conversations initially with the students were looking at the tension between sort of science and ancient wisdom and how does that play out, and thinking about indigenous communities. What I'll spend, just because I think my time is, I don't have a lot of time, so I'll just say the thing that I really want to share with you is the difficulty of thinking about intersectionality and thinking about how to, make it concrete and supportive for students. So we used intersectionality as an analytical tool, but I want to, if you could go to the next slide, I think this will be most useful for the audience. So this is based on Lynn Weber's work in the book Understanding Race, Class, Gender, and Sexuality, Conceptual Framework, and modified by my colleague, Dr. Tanya Shields. So what we would do for every film is we would, after talking about the context of the different ways that Weber on the left kind of situates questions around how to think about interrelated systems of oppression and power. So we would have that on the left, and then we would change the questions on the right for each film. And so it allowed students to work, and I won't go through, so I have fleshed out historical, geographical, contextual, understanding social construction of categories, power relationships, who's dominant, who's subordinate, what are the scales of that, macrostructural versus microstructural, face-to-face versus institution, and then simultaneously expressed. But then we would change the questions for each of the films. And this allowed students to think about issues of representation in the films very concretely, through the characters and what they were learning. But then we would also link it to, okay, how do we also think about vulnerable communities, vulnerable populations as we're going through the environmental work? So in many ways, it's synced together. And so shall we go to the final slide? Is that, oh, one more thing, just in terms of one of the innovations in the ways in which thinking about subjugated knowledges and intersectionality came together, we asked students to build a zine and do creative work that also incorporated empirical findings around, they had to pick an environmental topic, either one that we had discussed in class or one that they came up with, and then they had to build that out in terms of a creative, tangible, handmade project. And the group, we gave them a process for doing that. And these are just some of them here. So I think, the idea, subjugated knowledges we first started off with, but the intersectional grid was really helpful. And that was something that got added in maybe 4 or 5 weeks in.
Okay, so to wrap up, these are just some of the things we learned, and here's a nice photo of us on the last day of class. We found from teaching this course that students were really excited to engage with environmental issues from a transdisciplinary approach. So these are all issues that concern them, and it was nice for them to see them from these different sides. So often in the academy, these disciplines are pitted against each other, and I think it was great for them to see the three of us working together. And they were also happy to learn skills that help them watch films more critically than they normally would have.
For me, it was the first time I taught undergrads. So I'm in a professional school. I teach mainly master's and PhD students. And so I was quite surprised by how much knowledge they already had on the topics. I am also not accustomed to teaching 50-minute classes, and I realized that was not a lot of time to cover some of the content. And then I think for me, I was really pleasantly surprised by how well, the use of film and speculative fiction could, be used to engage students on public health and environmental health topics.
And I would just say one of the just keys for any co-teaching situation is being adaptable and flexible. We were also really lucky to have TA support because, as Courtney said, 50 minutes, we're just barely able to get through the kind of main topics that we wanted to, but really the conceptual scaffolding and layering work happened in our TA sections, but also that adaptability and flexibility. We would get together, obviously, in terms of our teaching teams and, really think about, okay, this is not going to work. We have to switch something up, or we have to, do something different than what we thought. And I would just really encourage you, if you're in the humanities, go and talk to your STEM folks, right? Like, think about the ways you can work together, because this was such a really, I think we all grew pedagogically in terms of our work and our learning. And I learned so much from my colleagues. So it was definitely a peak experience in terms of doing this kind of work.
Yep. Okay, that's all. Thank you. I'll stop sharing now.
So thank you, Dr. Berger, Dr. Woods, and Dr. Lane. Our last speaker today will be Dr. Susan Tananopavran. She's a lecturing fellow in the Thompson Writing Program at Duke University. Her research interests include contemporary American literature, ethnic studies, Asian American studies, and Latino studies. Her book, Latin Asian Cartographies, History, Writing, and the National Imaginary, examines how Asian American and Latino literature can help rewrite dominant narratives of US history. Her next project will explore what she calls ethnofuturism, or alternative speculative fiction by writers of color. Her other areas of interest include the medical humanities, women's and gender studies, and literature and the environment. She will now give a presentation called Teaching Alternative Futurisms.
Thank you. I'm sharing my, I hope, yeah, it says I'm screen sharing. So there we go. All right. So yes, I'm going to talk about my class, which is really like the ones that we've just heard about redefining how we imagine the future. Yeah. So the mid-20th century is often referred to as the golden age of science fiction in the United States, with the rise of genre magazine writing and the emergence of popular writers like Isaac Asimov, Robert Heinlein, Arthur C. Clarke, Ray Bradbury, and later Philip K. Dick and William Gibson and others. Many of these writers thoughtfully explored new technologies and their implications for future societies, as well as social concerns like fascism, censorship, and the ethics of artificial intelligence. They were less concerned with exploring social inequalities of race and gender, however, considering racism in particular as a problem rather easy and inevitable to solve. During this time, a dominant vision of the future emerged in which racial conflict was relegated to the past, while at the same time the future more or less replicated the racial hierarchies and often the sexual hierarchies of the 20th century. So an example of this race blindedness is the widely acclaimed integration of the cast of the original Star Trek, in which Mr. Sulu and Lieutenant Uhura's appearance on the bridge of the Starship Enterprise demonstrated to the world that racism was over, even though everyone was still under the command of the white male Captain Kirk. And here they're kind of like even back in the corner, hidden behind other people. This kind of future was deemed bold for its inclusion of racial minorities, and yet whiteness remained the invisible default. The racial order was basically preserved, even while racism was portrayed as an ancient problem already solved by future societies. In more recent years, female writers and writers of color have really challenged this idea. So even in the 20th century, Afrofuturists like visionary writer Octavia Butler asked us to imagine different worlds. The last 10 to 20 years or so has really seen an explosion of science fiction and fantasy by writers of color. So in the United States, N.K. Jemisin, Nnedi Okorafor, Ted Chiang, and Rebecca Roanhorse have received the prestigious Hugo and Nebula Awards for their insightful fiction. Outside of the US, Afrofuturism continues to thrive in films like Kenyan Wanuru Kahiu's Pumsy, which we just heard about, and Ghanaian Francis Bodomo's Afronauts. Chinese science fiction has found a world audience with Cixin Liu's The Three Body Problem trilogy, and US writer Ken Liu has introduced a new genre of Asian American sci-fi he calls silk punk. Other categories of speculative fiction have also seen increasing representation by artists of color. To name just a few: Marjorie Liu's graphic novels, Janelle Monáe's music albums, Rosaura Sanchez and Beatriz Pita's academic fiction, and of course, Marvel's Black Panther, one of the highest grossing films of all time. So why do I ask my students to engage with these texts, and what does it mean to engage with speculative fiction by writers of color? It means, for one thing, changing dominant perceptions of who matters both now and in the future. So according to Stanford scholar Paula M.L. Moya, engaging with literature by writers of color can have a psychological effect on readers in ways that facts alone cannot. Moya is especially concerned with what she calls racial schemas, which are basically our understanding of the way race operates in our society. According to Moya, racial schemas are both emotional and epistemological because, in the words of poet Lorna D. Cervantes, racism is not intellectual. Given the political events of the past 4 years, we now know more than ever that facts alone do not often change minds or deeply impact people's ideas about nationalism, racial hierarchies, or social inequalities. Literature written by racial others, however, can engage people emotionally by asking readers to identify with its characters. And I wonder if this really kind of intersects with what Renee was talking about with her discussion of ethical world traveling. In Moya's words, literature's constitutive heteroglossia enables an author and a reader to engage dialogically at a deep emotional and epistemological level with the difficult questions around race, culture, and inequality that are inevitably posed by a good multicultural work of literature. Moya is not naive. She does not posit that this shift in understanding happens automatically, and indeed she rather skeptically suggests that cross-racial empathy is more likely to occur between members of different minority groups than rather than among white readers who might resist the idea that racism exists. Still, reading this literature, and I would argue watching these films, lays out conditions in which epistemological growth can happen. And it was in search of this kind of growth, as well as a desire to engage students in the powerful social critiques proposed by speculative fiction by writers of color, that in 2016, I developed a course for Duke University's first-year writing program called Ethnofuturism: Writing the Future of Race. Inspired by a wide body of literature and film that engages science fiction with issues of racial justice, I borrowed the word ethnofuturism from a 2015 call for papers issued by MELIS, the Society for the Study of the Multi-Ethnic Literatures of the US. Ethnofuturism in this sense refers to literature, film, and other art by people of color that uses science fiction tropes to imagine alternative possibilities for the future. It's a convenient term not to replace the foundational concept of Afrofuturism, but to consider how Asian American, Latina and Latino, and Indigenous writers and artists are also contributing to the imagining of science fiction and fantasy worlds. This course, now in its 4th iteration, asks students to explore issues of race and social justice as they intersect with science and technology in a wide variety of texts that might be considered science fiction. My design of this course relies on 3 important aspects of speculative fiction by writers of color that I consider to create conditions for possible epistemological growth and change. First, this fiction decenters whiteness, making visible how much our society takes for granted the present and future dominance of Euro-American traditions and values. Natasha Womack, in her book Afrofuturism, gives a brilliant analysis of the painting Keeping the Culture by Carrie James Marshall, which portrays a Black family with African artifacts in their home, a home that happens to be in outer space. This painting, in which children of African descent are learning about Earth from a holographic image in their living room, forces viewers to question what the default human race looks like from outer space, along with what culture future humans will keep, as well as what values. And of course, Black Panther does this really brilliantly. My course includes both Butler and Black Panther, and I just don't have time to talk about everything. Decentering whiteness can also take the form of deepening the social critiques of classic science fiction. So one of the most widely taught films in academia for the last, 30 to 40 years is Ridley Scott's original Blade Runner. The basic plot of Blade Runner involves the moral qualms of a policeman tasked with executing runaway androids called replicants, who are virtually indistinct from human beings. As an intellectual endeavor, Blade Runner raises some important questions about humanity, such as, is it ethical to create androids to act as slaves? If memories are false, can they have real emotional weight or meaning? And the big one, what makes us human? And yet, as interesting as Blade Runner is, it becomes far more interesting when read through the work of Asian-Canadian author Larissa Lai, who retells the story from the perspective of one of the female androids. In the film, this android, Rachel, does not know she is an android until she fails the test meant to determine whether she is human. The scenario that fails her is when she is asked to imagine a banquet in which the entree consists of boiled dog. In Lai's story and poem about this character, however, Lai reimagines Rachel as half Chinese, a situation that reminds us that racism often takes the form of claiming that others are not human. And certainly the accusation of dog eating has been a staple of Western anti-Asian racism for years. Her work asks us not only what makes us human, but also how have we denied and do we continue to deny humanity to others? Lai's rewriting of this canonical science fiction text also calls into question the gendered politics that went unquestioned when the movie was first made in 1982. So my students today are horrified by the movie's supposedly romantic scenes in which Harrison Ford's character sexually coerces the android Rachel into kissing and later into intercourse. The character Rachel in the film is silent and silenced. Lai's reworking of it gives her a voice, making us question whether her silence is because she is an android or whether it is because of the power differential between an older white man and a young woman of color. In this way, decentering whiteness can accomplish even more than the important goal of insisting on the achievements and potential of people of color to imagine like Renee was talking earlier, the radical act of imagining Blackness in the future, but it can also deepen social critiques in necessary ways. So in Lai's case, shifting the focus of the story from the white male hero to the young female android and identifying her as a person of color insists on the importance of race and gender in determining who counts and why. If decentering whiteness is one important effect of speculative fiction by writers of color, a second potential of this fiction is its powerful critique of how racism and social inequality are inextricably entangled with neoliberal economics and global capitalism. In classic 20th century science fiction, racism was, as I said, a problem of the past, solved without comment as part of the sophistication of the future. In this world, social progress and technological progress went hand in hand, and better technology meant a better life for everyone. This powerful belief in the benefits of technology is still held by untold members of our society, including a strange but very wealthy group of people seeking what they call the singularity, by which they mean the moment in which humans will merge with machines, ushering in a new utopia for everyone. The flip side of this, of course, is the Terminator or Matrix situation in which machines become sentient and enslave humans. Neither premise, I suggest, is particularly realistic or particularly complicated because neither takes seriously the relationship between capitalism, technological development, and social inequalities that already exist on Earth. Many sci-fi texts by writers of color, on the other hand, take this relationship very seriously, imagining and warning us about the logical endgame of current capitalistic practices. So an important case in point is Latino filmmaker Alex Rivera's 2008 film Sleep Dealer, which depicts a dystopian future in which the US-Mexico border is closed and fully militarized. The film is largely a critique of the US exploitation of Mexican labor, as Mexican workers in this future must perform jobs in the US remotely. Their bodies located in factories along the border are hooked up to nodes that virtually control robots in the US. The work eventually kills them, but they are considered replaceable as their actual bodies never even enter the US. So as one factory manager says, the US finally has what it's always wanted, all of the work with none of the workers. In this critique of neoliberal policies, new technology both connects people by allowing them to biologically plug into remote experiences and disconnects and exploits them. So instead of leading to a utopia in which technology magically liberates people from their racism, or leading to a dystopia in which the machines take over the world, this kind of critique is much more realistic. Technology enhances inequalities that are already present. The US already knows what it wants, all the Mexican labor with none of the workers, and technology and capital serve those ends. In this way, speculative fiction by writers of color acts as a social critique, not only warning us about the future, but also about the present. So my students today laugh at the film's dated special effects, but at the same time, they're really amazed and appalled to see Trump's wall fully realized in a film from 2008 when they were 4 years old. Good speculative fiction always warns us that the future is now. The third potential of speculative fiction by writers of color that I will discuss is that it can help us think critically about science itself by drawing on diverse cultural traditions. So one novel that I love to teach is Japanese American writers Ruth Ozeki's A Tale for the Time Being, which pairs quantum mechanics with Zen Buddhism to envision humanity within an ecosystem in which the entanglement of beings leads to unexpected connections and consequences. The novel's plot is far too complicated to get into here, but its central theme involves theorizing connections between people, animals, material goods, and the environment, and also trying to theorize these connections in time, which essentially means theorizing cause and effect. For example, one character leaves his Silicon Valley job when he realizes that the machine interface he is designing has the unintentional consequence of making military weaponry too easy and even fun to employ, like a video game with real-life consequences. Throughout the novel, the main character thinks her father is pathetic for losing his job. It is only later that she and we, the readers, begin to understand the heroism involved in his failed attempt to create a conscience for military technology. This heroism lies in acknowledging the cause and effect link between technology and its misapplications, or rather the use of technology for harm. In Ozeki's novel, the realization that events and beings are entangled is both Buddhist and a result of quantum physics. Her characters explore Hugh Everett's many worlds hypothesis and the mysteries of Schrodinger's cat, but they find meaning in Buddhist philosophy. In the end, Ozeki forces us to question our involvement in technologies of harm and how we might connect with others in ways that transcend the violence around us. Science fiction predicts the future, but it is not only a prediction. Science fiction also shapes how we imagine the future, and our imagination shapes our ideas of what is possible. We often think of these predictions in terms of technology and inventions. So like Jules Verne's submarine or William Gibson's cyberspace or the targeted advertising and Minority Report. But perhaps even more important are the ways we imagine our future societies. Who leads our imagined futures? What are the societal norms in these futures? What sorts of dystopias do we fear, and what kinds of futures do we hope for? Ultimately, science fiction's future is a reflection of our hopes, fears, and observations about the present. By projecting today's hopes and fears into the future, science fiction allows us the space to examine issues of social justice, particularly as they intersect with science, technology, and that ambiguously valued social change that we call progress. Thank you.
So we now have 15 minutes for final discussion. So if anyone would like to ask questions, we'll open up the floor.
I would love to hear Renee discuss that assignment that she was going to discuss and ran out of time for.
Thank you for that. This is it's an assignment, and also just know I was taking so many notes throughout you all's presentations of things that I want to still get to see or read. So thank you all. So for each of the assignments, in each of the classes, students have to do a scripting assignment where they either excerpt part of a text and figure out how they're going to put it on their bodies and stage it, adapt part of a text, or create an independent script of their own that responds to the text. So the performance that the students recently did and recorded for themselves was taking into account Nnedi Okorafor's Shuri, the comic Shuri, Binti, Yihimba from the story Yihimba's Choice, a short story Yihimba's Choice, Max, the main character in, oh, why am I blanking right now? I'll have to, I don't know why it just left my head for the moment, but Max, who is the main character in Samuel Delaney's story, Black No More, and I'll talk about each of these in a second, but they had read each of these stories. So just very briefly, in Yihimba's Choice, a young girl from a rural community on the continent of Africa, whose community engages in female genital mutilation, and she's getting ready to go through this rite of passage. And she's having questions from within her own community about this, but afraid of this mythical being that can come and attack her if she doesn't do it. And we're told that the beast has power because men's fears feed this beast. So in her story, she meets another female traveler who helps give her the reflection and the strength she needs to go and make some change in her own community, understanding that the change may not happen in her lifetime. So this is, again, not getting into the nuance of each of these, but giving you a sense of what the students were engaging. So that was Yihimba. In Binti, we have a young girl who is from a Himba community on Earth, who's traveling, a first generation student going to an intergalactic university, who experiences a horrific trauma on her route there. And has to engage with the prejudices which comes from being the first person from her community to go to university, being charged for the crimes, called to task for crimes that Earthlings committed, but her ethnic group did not commit, having to engage in tactics of peacemaking as part of her superpower that rely on a technology of math. So kind of mixing modernity and tradition. And Shuri, who is a Wakandan superpower in and of herself. So I won't go into her because I think we all have a kind of context for Shuri. What they decided to do, especially as first year students, many of whom aren't on campus right now because of COVID-19, and who talked early about, feeling anxiety about not getting to have a traditional first year experience, make the kind of friendships. Many of them are first generation students. They decided to imagine each of these students as first generation students who are coming to campus at the same time. So they start their scenes in their cars, all arriving with the understandings, fears, prejudices, of what this might be like, what they may encounter. They all embody the characters that they're performing. Max and Black No More he's gonna go into a magic machine to turn him white. And he's dealing with what he might lose culturally, but what he might gain by the ticket of whiteness. So they end up in a first year class together and engage in a project that has them, they really try to imagine what would these characters who are also engaging UNC, current UNC students, what would they argue about? What would they talk about? And they took each one of those characters' positions seriously and having the conversation and using the tools that were at hand to do so in ways that showed their empathy and ways that showed their understandings of the powers dynamics in each of their situations and race and ethnicity in each of their situations. So I just thought it was smart. It was savvy. It made those texts talk to one another in ways that were productive. And because they included a current UNC student in the mix, it also let them talk about what some of their understandings of racial mobility or immobility might be like here right now. So it was about a 5-minute performance that they did.
Thanks. I love creative projects. That one sounds really rewarding.
Thank you.
I'll chime in since we're gonna have to wrap up soon. Thank you so much, everyone, for staying with us, even though we had to go over time some. I'll wait if there's maybe one last question for the panel.
I have a question. I haven't quite completed it yet, but I've completed a part of it. So I guess the unique feature of science fiction is in a sense the way that it removes the restraints and limitations that we face in our daily life. We are always relating to some kind of context, and there are always expectations on how we should behave. And I have sort of an open questions. What is like the most important thing that science fictions can remove in terms of restraints? Like what are the largest opportunities with science fictions? What does it enable us to do that we're not able to do in any other context?
I can offer a short answer and we'll see if any of the other panelists want to chime in. One of the things I love about science fiction is that I think it allows us to kind of imagine alternative solutions, imagine different solutions to the current problems that we have. And I think, especially in these political times, a lot of things feel so circular. We keep going round and round in a circle, same problems coming up, trying to use the same solutions. So I feel like science fiction enables us to just like start from scratch or just scrap everything and think of something totally new that might possibly be the answer to some of these problems that have been plaguing us.
I can add to that, Priscilla. I think that yes, it can help us imagine possible solutions and possible alternatives, right? Like I'm thinking of Black Panther, such a rich alternative future. I think science fiction can also help us explore the logical endgame of various practices that are heading us toward disaster, right? So I think Sleep Dealer is a great example of that. Both of us talked, two of the three people, Priscilla, Courtney, and Michelle, and I all talked about Sleep Dealer because it explores so many different logical endgames of harmful practices, including water shortages, corporate control of water, end of sustainable agricultural practices, as well as exploitation of Mexican labor. So I think the way that it can project consequences of things that are actually happening now, but are largely invisible in ways that make them visible for a wider audience is really powerful.
And I just wanted to chime in. One, I know, Susan, you didn't get a chance to talk about, you showed the N.K. Jemisin, one of the Broken Earth series ones. And I think that absolutely, fits within the same trajectory you're talking about. And I think in addition to those two things, I think it also gives us the opportunity to sometimes visualize the horrors that can be taken for granted. For example, I didn't know, I'm not a person who grew up liking horror or horror movies because I'm a scaredy cat. And so I would get too nervous. And as an adult, some of my favorite horror gets to visualize as monsters the monstrousness of racism or sexism or some of the ills that we're dealing with in society, and picturing those as monsters gives new vocabulary for the harm and violence that they are doing, bigger than the physicalized monsters we might see on the screen. So thinking about some of those things in context of horror, some of the horrors that exist within our own socio-political environment is cathartic in a weird way, because it goes, yes, that is the big bad thing that's harming me. That is what it feels like, right? And so I think that is also part of its potential.
Yeah, and I would say not just horror, but in addition to horror, taking situations and displacing them onto aliens or displacing them onto other populations that they don't exist. It can help us sort of get outside of problems. And you were talking about Binti, right? So colonialism is just a huge theme in Binti. And yet this is all displaced onto this story of a girl going into outer space in ways that may help us interrogate colonialism on Earth a little bit better. Or like back to Sleep Dealer, it displaces the drone warfare in the Middle East into a Mexican situation in ways that help you visualize the horror of being on the other side of a drone war. My students always find that really powerful.
On that note, I think I will wrap up, just, because I know everybody, it's Friday afternoon, we're tired, people are probably still anxiously checking news updates. So thank you again to everyone on the panel. Thank you to Dana for moderating this panel. And also, to everyone in the audience who joined us either yesterday or today. I hope there's a lot of food for thought. I know I jotted down a bunch of titles, and I plan on watching one of those scarier films that Evan mentioned, because for me, horror has been a comfort in these times. But yeah, for whatever is consoling for you, I wish everybody a great weekend, and we will put the recording of of today's panel on the website for everyone to check out later. But yeah, just thanks to everyone again, and have a great Friday afternoon. And for Aiden, I know you're in the UK, so it's probably already the evening there. Have a great Friday night.
Thank you, Priscilla.